One night in May of 1896, a young opera singer sat inside of her dressing room at the Palais Garnier, which is this huge, beautiful theater in Paris, France. A little while earlier, she'd finished a performance of a very famous opera, and now she was getting changed and taking off her makeup. However, as she was doing this, she suddenly heard this sound in the theater that immediately sent goosebumps up and down her body. It sounded like a man was singing somewhere out there, and his voice was very deep and very sad. And really, it wasn't so much the sound of the voice that was so unsettling. It was just the fact that she was hearing anybody in the theater at all. I mean, she should have been alone in the theater. As far as she knew, all of the other performers and crew members had already gone home, so who was this? And so she left her room and she stepped out into the hallway and just began looking around, thinking maybe one of the other opera singers had maybe stayed behind without her knowing. But she didn't see anybody else backstage. And as she listened carefully to, again, this man who was still singing somewhere in the theater, she realized that the voice was actually coming from below her. And this revelation made her go from just being unsettled to being genuinely scared. So before she had ever worked in this theater, she'd actually heard a rumor about this theater. It was said that for the past several years, a man had been secretly living inside of this theater. And apparently, this same man had been horribly injured in a fire at a different theater that was nearby. And now he was, too scared to show his face in public. So he squatted in the basement and the walls of the Palais Garnier and only ever came out at night when he believed he was alone. Now, this woman, this young opera singer, had always assumed that, this was just obviously some legend made up to scare people or maybe even to entice people to come to this theater. But now, standing in the hallway and clearly hearing this strange, sad voice echoing up from beneath her feet, she really couldn't help but feel like maybe this story is true, and how terrifying a thought that was. However, as she stood there listening to this voice, she sort of slowly began to convince herself that maybe it actually wasn't a man's voice. Maybe this was the sound of water moving through the pipes or something like that. I mean, to be honest, the sound was sort of far away. And she's thinking, maybe I'm convincing myself this is an actual person's voice. Maybe it's not. And so she's sitting there listening, and sure enough, after a couple of minutes, she really had convinced herself that, no, this is not a person. This is just like late night sounds the theater makes, and I'm not really here a lot by myself, and I've never heard this before, so this is nothing. And so she quickly, because she told herself she was convinced of this, but deep down she wasn't, but she quickly went back into her dressing room, she gathered up her things, and she left for the night. A few days later, on the evening of May 20th, that same young opera singer was waiting in the wings just off stage. She and the rest of the cast were in the middle of a performance, and she was waiting for her cue to go on stage. But as she was watching the show from backstage, she suddenly saw movement above the stage, way up in the rafters. And she looked up and she saw there was a man in dark clothes who was up there. Now, at first, she thought, maybe this man is a stagehand. But as she continued to look at him, she realized he wasn't doing anything. He was just crouched up there, sort of hiding from everybody else, just sort of staring down at the performance, like he was watching the performance. But then, as this young opera singer is staring up at this guy, he suddenly turned and looked right at her. And this young singer, she had to hold back a gasp because this man's face was obviously just totally disfigured by what appeared to be burn scars. And so terrified, this woman turns, she rushes and grabs a crew member, and she points up into the rafters and says there's somebody up there. But when they both looked up again, the man in dark clothes with the burned face was gone. Now, the young singer, she felt certain that what she had seen just moments before was real. But the crew member was looking at her like, are you sure you saw that? Like, this seems pretty far-fetched. Like, why would anyone be up there? Certainly not some random person. Like, what are you talking about? And so she didn't know what to do, but the show she was in had to go on. About an hour later, the young singer was standing on stage and bowing in front of a crowd of nearly 2,000 people. She and the rest of the cast had just finished performing Act 1, and the young singer had barely made it through the performance because she was still so shaken up by what she had seen backstage, up in the rafters. All she wanted to do was get off stage and spend intermission calming down. But now, even though it was only the end of Act 1, the crowd was so excited and they loved the performance. She had just done so much. They were calling for her, specifically her, to do an encore of her last aria. The singer knew she didn't really have a choice. So she nodded to the conductor and then reluctantly stepped forward and restarted the piece. And as she sang, her anxiety actually began to melt away. She let herself get lost in the music, she closed her eyes, and she belted a high note. But suddenly, she heard this ear-splitting bang, and she opened her eyes just in time to see a brief flash of light. Then she watched in horror as the giant glass chandelier that hung above the audience came crashing down and landed directly on top of a woman, killing her instantly. Police immediately launched an investigation into the falling chandelier, but quickly determined that the whole thing was really just a freak accident. They said that one of the chandelier's candles had caused a small fire, which had melted the cord that held it up and caused it to fall. But the young singer, she didn't believe this, because she'd seen that burned man in the rafters just, less than an hour before the disaster, and she couldn't help but feel like he was to blame. And her theory, as wild as it sounded, actually gained traction. Eventually, a journalist named Gaston Leroux heard about it and started his own investigation. He spent weeks searching for the burned man, even showing up unannounced at the theater at different times of day and night to try to catch him. But he never did. However, Gaston did track down some construction workers who had helped build the theater 20 years earlier, and they claimed they knew exactly who the burned man was. So before the Palais Garnier was built, there had been another theater right down the block. But that theater had been completely destroyed by a fire 20 years earlier in 1873. On the night of that fire, a young pianist named Ernest had been inside the building, working on a wedding march for his fiancée, who was a ballerina at the theater. Out of nowhere, he began to smell smoke, and then before he knew it, flames blocked his only way out. He had no choice but to run through the flames, and by doing that, he suffered terrible facial injuries, but he would survive. Unfortunately, though, his fiancée did not make it out. She died in the fire. The construction workers told Gaston that after this horrible tragedy, Ernest had sort of removed himself from society. Like, not only did the burns make it difficult for him to be in public, he was, self-conscious, but also he was racked with grief about losing his fiancée. And so they said Ernest had taken refuge in the basement of the Palais Garnier, which at this point was just under construction. And the construction workers said they heard Ernest playing the piano at all hours in this basement, obsessively trying to finish that wedding march for his fiancée. And often while he was doing this, he was screaming and crying out in agony. Now, the workers told Gaston that eventually they stopped hearing Ernest, and they assumed at that point he had left, or maybe even died. Or they said, it's possible they never heard him at all, and they had convinced themselves that they were hearing him down there. They didn't know. But then, after that, performers at the now finished Palais Garnier reported hearing this sad voice singing after hours in the building. And some even reported seeing a scarred man, the scars on his face, creeping around the dark corners of the theater. But when these people would periodically investigate to see where it was coming from and who is that, nobody was ever there. And so after hearing this story from these construction workers, Gaston Leroux, the journalist, was, sort of conflicted in a way. On the one hand, he was sort of disturbed by, these two tragedies separated by 20 years. You have the fire that claimed the life of Ernest's fiancée and, apparently badly hurt Ernest. And then you have this chandelier falling and killing a guest at the theater at the Palais Garnier 20 years later. So that was horrible. That was tragic. But more than that, the feeling that Gaston had was that he felt sort of deeply moved by the story of Ernest's love for his fiancée. Whether or not the story was even true, whether or not he really did go into the basement as construction was being done and, try to finish that song for his dead fiancée. It didn't really matter. It was like that combined with these rumors of there being, this ghost in the theater. It was just kind of moving. The idea that, poor Ernest and his fiancée. That's what stuck out to the journalist. And so ultimately, Gaston ended up writing a book about this story, and the book was then adapted into one of the most famous musicals of all time. Today, Ernest is more often known by the nickname that Gaston Leroux gave him, the Phantom of the Opera. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. On September 29, 1939, a British intelligence agent walked through the door of the Royal Navy headquarters in London with an envelope tucked under his arm. When he stepped inside, a doorman stopped him and asked to see his pass. The agent flashed a badge that identified himself by the codename 17F, and the doorman simply nodded and let him through. Agent 17F then continued farther into the building, and he went down this long, silent white hallway to a black door with the number 39 painted on it. After looking around to make sure nobody was watching him, he reached down and he turned the handle and pushed the door open. And right away, he was hit by this brightly lit office, and inside it was absolutely chaotic. The air was full of smoke from tobacco, telephones were ringing off the hook, typewriters were clattering away, and men in dark suits were rushing back and forth. This was the office of Great Britain's Director of Naval Intelligence, and World War II had just broken out just a few weeks ago, so everything was nuts. The spies that worked in this office were literally out gathering intel and analyzing data, and also coming up with creative, sort of crazy ways to literally trick the enemy. Now, Agent 17F was not actually an intelligence agent. He was the director's personal assistant, so he had no spy training. But he was very creative and had a way of coming up with schemes that were so crazy they just might work. And that really was a skill the department desperately needed right now. The director was really practical and analytical and pragmatic, and so he sort of liked having someone around in his personal assistant, 17F, whose thought patterns were just much more colorful. I mean, he really thought differently than the director. So Agent 17F very casually walked into this chaotic room, and he strolled across the floor, and he reached the director's door and he knocked. And a moment later, the director called for him to come in, and 17F walked inside, walked right over to the desk where the director was sitting, and he dropped that envelope he was carrying right on the desk. And the director picked it up, he opened the envelope, and started reading what was inside. And as the director's eyes scanned the page, Agent 17F couldn't help but see what looked like an annoyed look come across the director's face. So inside the envelope was a list of ideas that 17F had come up with for spreading misinformation to the Germans. Basically, they were ways to confuse and misdirect the German military by giving them fake information about what the British were up to. Now, this is a very normal thing that virtually every military does during a time of war. But these specific strategies that Agent 17F had come up with on this list were really out there. I mean, even for his own standards, these were sort of wild. For example, on this list, there was included this idea to have the British drop soccer balls covered in reflective paint into the ocean so that enemy submarines would, mistake them for explosives. There was another suggestion to put fake intelligence messages into literal bottles and just set them loose at sea and hope Germans found them. 17F also said he wanted to mail out fake copies of the Times newspaper with made-up news stories and made-up headlines to, again, sort of trick their enemy. And so Agent 17F had been pretty excited to share this list with the director. I mean, he was proud of these ideas. But now, looking at the director, it seemed like he was just getting really frustrated. And so 17F wondered if maybe he'd pushed it too far. But just then, the director stopped and clearly was fixated on one particular idea on this list. And he looked up at 17F and he said, actually, this one seems workable. So the idea that the director liked was actually based on something that happened in a crime novel that Agent 17F had read. Agent 17F was suggesting that they borrow a corpse from the naval hospital, dress it in a British pilot's uniform, and put fake dispatches in its pockets with details of a supposed military operation. They then put a faulty parachute on the corpse's back and fly over the German coast and drop the corpse out onto the beach. And when the Germans found the corpse, the idea was that they would obviously assumed that this was an actual pilot who had died when his parachute failed. And then if they believed that, well, they'd very likely believe that the information the British agents planted in the corpse's pockets were actual military secrets that they'd intercepted. And so in the end, the director told Agent 17F that, you know what, this is actually pretty good. You did a good job after all. And so by the time Agent 17F left the director's office and walked over to his own desk in the corner, he was feeling proud that at least one of his big swings had potentially landed. 4 years later, at a pivotal moment in World War II, the British put a version of 17F's plan into action. They called it Operation Mincemeat, and amazingly, it worked. British spies did plant a corpse out on the beach with the faulty parachute with documents in its pockets saying that the Allied powers of America and Britain were going to invade Greece and Sardinia, which prompted the Germans to move a ton of their troops away from the Allies' real target, which was the island of Sicily. Sicily is part of Italy, and Italy was allied with Germany during World War II. And so thanks in part to Operation Mincemeat, 17F's big idea, the Germans were totally caught off guard by the invasion of Sicily, and the Allies captured the entire island. This then paved the way for an invasion of mainland Italy, which was a major turning point in the war. And again, it was all because of this one idea inspired by Agent 17F. Now, to be clear, Agent 17F was not personally there for the invasion, and he didn't publicly get credit for his role in planning it, even though Operation Mincemeat would become pretty famous. But anonymity was super important for anyone working in intelligence, which 17F was. And when the war ended, 17F might have stayed a ghost forever. But one slow afternoon at the end of the war, when the chaos in Room 39 had died down and there were only a couple dozen people still working out of that office, Agent 17F was sitting at his desk in the corner, and the other agents nearby were talking to each other about what they were going to do next. And Agent 17F, even though he wasn't a part of their conversation, internally, he sort of asked himself the same question, like, what am I going to do next? I mean, he was so good at coming up with these wild ideas, and he really had so much fun doing it. Like, how could he just stop doing that and go have a normal job? Like, this was his calling. Doing what he did now is the only thing he wanted to do. But then he realized as he was sitting there that maybe he didn't have to stop doing this. After the war, for years, Agent 17F kept on coming up with fantastical spy ideas. But this time, instead of giving these ideas to the government, he wrote them all down with the intention of someday making a book around these ideas. And finally, in 1953, he published the first book under his real name, Ian Fleming. And his book was wildly successful, and he went on to write more books all about this same character who was a spy. And that spy's name was James Bond. One fall afternoon in 1830, a beaver trapper named Smith and his hunting partner, whose name was Bauman, hiked through the Bitterroot Mountains, which is a section of the Rocky Mountains in southwestern Montana. Now, where they were headed was this remote pond deep in the woods that was rumored to be full of beavers. However, despite that, nobody really ever dared to go there because the area was also said to be cursed. Now, the reasoning behind, this rumor, the cursed rumor, is that about a year ago, a hunter had traveled to the pond on his own and he'd never come back home. And eventually miners had passed through that area and they found his body, and his body had basically been torn to shreds and actually partially eaten. And so naturally, rumors had begun to spread that, this pond was home to some kind of man-eating monster. But Smith and Bauman, they didn't believe in curses or monsters. They believed in money, and they knew that they'd make a lot of money from all the beavers they would catch at this pond. And so after several hours of hiking through the forest, Smith and Bauman did finally arrive at this cursed pond, and they hurried to set up their camp. They gathered firewood and they built a lean-to where they would stay for the next few nights. And then after that, they set up a few beaver traps around the pond and then followed this nearby stream several miles uphill and set up beaver traps along the way. And so when they were done setting all these traps, it was around sunset, Smith and Bauman decided to head back to their camp, the lean-to they had set up, and make some dinner and then go to bed. And so down the hill they went, and they're getting closer and closer to their campsite. And keep in mind, there's nobody else out here. They are in the middle of the forest. And as they're approaching their campsite, when they got within range and could actually see it, they just stopped. Because their lean-to they had put together as soon as they got there, their lean-to and all their gear had basically been torn to shreds. It's like their campsite had a tornado come through it, and everything was just kind of all over the place. And there was no people, no animals, no nothing. It was like something had happened while they were up the hill setting up these traps. Now, Smith and Bauman, their reaction was not, oh my goodness, like a monster came through here. They're like, great, a bear must have come through, because bears were in this area. So this is like a nuisance at this point. This is not confirmation that the pond is haunted and that there's a monster here. They're just like, great, we got to reset up our camp now. So the two men walked over to their destroyed campsite and began rebuilding it. But as they were, putting their lean-to back together and, packaging up their gear back into their bags, something really stood out that was pretty odd. So they're thinking that a bear must have come through here. And why would a bear come through here? Why would a bear tear all this stuff apart? Well, because the bear would be looking for food, as bears are known to do. But as they're packaging things up, both Smith and Bauman are seeing that none of their food was taken. Like, no food has been taken, and quite a bit of it was out in the open. So there certainly was opportunity, but it wasn't. And so they're thinking, that's so weird. Like, clearly a big effort was made to look through the campsite for something. It wasn't like an animal came over and just batted it around and then left. There had to be a reason. Like, what were they looking for? Like, what's going on here? That's so odd. But both men figured that what likely had happened here was, as they were coming back down the hill, this bear must have heard them and ran off before taking their food. And so ultimately they felt like they had just gotten really lucky here. And so Bauman went to go start a campfire to make their dinner, and Smith finished putting back together their lean-to camp. But just a little while later, as Smith reconstructed their lean-to, he couldn't shake the feeling that there really was something odd about whatever had happened here. They had this explanation that maybe they got lucky, but it just felt sort of weird, especially considering that there was lots of lore about this place being kind of dangerous to people. Forget whether it's a curse or a monster. There was just a fear that something odd was going on here. And so Smith, he said to Bauman, hey, I'm just gonna, for my own sanity here, look around and just look for tracks. Let's confirm that this really was a bear. And so, Bauman's like, great, go for it. He's, setting up the fire. And Smith, began walking away from the campsite looking for tracks. However, after stepping just a few feet away from, the campfire and their campsite, Smith realized it was just too dark out to actually see anything on the ground. So he went back to the campsite, he grabbed a torch, and he lit it in the fire that Bauman had made. And then now, with this light source, he left the campsite and began scanning the ground, looking for, the tracks from this bear. And at first, he didn't see anything. There were no tracks. It was just, some broken leaves and, There were some broken sticks and some, brush that had been sort of trampled over that suggested an animal had come through here, but again, there were no tracks. And so he's walking farther and farther away from their campsite until he gets to this clearing that was actually not very far from their campsite. But in this clearing, he found some tracks. There were these massive paw prints that were in the ground, tracks from this animal with huge claws, like massive, massive paws, that certainly suggested this was a bear. And in a way, this was sort of reassuring for Smith, because ultimately he was going out here to confirm that this was a bear, right? This wasn't anything else, this was a bear. But as he's looking at these tracks and watching them sort of meander their way through this clearing and, back off into the woods, he noticed something strange about these tracks. Yes, they were paw prints that certainly suggested they were a bear. But the way they were landing in the ground suggested it was just 2 paws, not 4. And a bear walks on all 4. Whatever creature was leaving behind these prints was walking on 2 legs. Bears don't do that. And so Smith couldn't help but feel like a little unnerved. I mean, he's seeing clear as day prints of a bipedal creature with huge paws, huge claws, walking around near their campsite. I mean, what did this? Is this a bear? He knew bears could get up on their hind legs, but they don't walk very far on just their hind legs. And so this was unsettling. And again, as much as he wasn't scared of, the curse or monsters that were out here, it was hard not to think, like, is there truth to that stuff? And so Smith, sort of rattled, he turns around and hustles back to the campsite, and he tells Bauman, I found tracks, and I think it's bear tracks. But whatever it is walking around on 2 legs. Like, I'm telling you, it's 2 legs. There's no 4-legged creature walking around. And Bauman laughed. He actually thought that Smith was just like playing a joke on him, like, you're trying to scare me out here, right? But Smith is like, I'm not joking. Like, I'm telling you, the tracks 100% are of an animal walking around on 2 legs. And it appears to be an enormous bear, And, Bauman at this point, he's like, well, bears can walk on their hind legs, but both of them are like, yeah, but again, not for long periods of time. And so the 2 men really didn't know what to make of this. I mean, by this point, their campsite was set back up, they had their fire, their things are sort of back to normal, and they're not hearing any animals or anything odd in the vicinity. And so pretty quickly, they both were like, well, I guess that was just a standing bear. Hopefully it doesn't come back. And they just sat down by the fire and ate their dinner. So after dinner, the 2 men eventually did decide to just go to sleep. They were sort of in denial about the weirdness that was going on at their campsite, but they had both sort of, without saying anything, elected to just not talk about it and just bury those feelings and just ignore this gut instinct, this almost primal instinct that something was off here. And so the 2 men, they climbed into their lean-to tent together and they lied down next to each other, and eventually they drifted off to sleep. Several hours later, when Smith and Bauman were both fast asleep inside of this lean-to right next to each other, there was this loud, almost moaning sound coming from somewhere in the forest. And it was loud enough that it woke both Smith and Bauman up. And so they sit up inside of their lean-to. It's dark, but they can basically see each other. And they're sort of saying to each other, like, hey, did you hear that? Like, what was that? Neither of them knew, but now they're sort of on edge. And they're sitting in their lean-to, obviously thinking about the fact that, this bear or whatever it was had clearly come through here the day before. They're hoping it's not coming back. And they're sitting there listening really intently to the noises coming from the forest. And there are regular night noises, all across the forest, bugs and birds and animals, that kind of thing. But as they're straining to listen, they can hear something huge is making its way through the tree line in their direction. And so Bauman sort of reflexively grabbed his rifle and, he's just holding onto his rifle, wondering what he's gonna do. And Smith too is sort of not sure what to do. And then at some point, as whatever this is got close enough to their lean-to, they can't see it. They're too scared to poke their head out to look, but they know it's getting closer. When it got close enough, they began to smell whatever it was. It was like this musty earth smell. And as the 2 men are like getting ready to actually make a plan about what to do, like obviously this thing is back, whatever it is, They hear the noise again that woke them up, but now it's literally coming from right outside of their lean-to. And it's this guttural, loud, almost like human moaning sound, but it's definitely not a person. It's just this eerie, low, rumbling sound, and it's right outside the tent. And Bauman, as soon as he heard this, he just turned and he aimed his rifle and fired basically roughly in the direction of where this thing was, which again is right outside their lean-to. And as soon as he fired, both men heard the sound of this huge creature right outside their lean-to turn and start running into the forest, just bounding through the trees. Trees are crashing. It's this totally chaotic sound as this huge thing is retreating into the woods. And then at some point, all the noise stops and they don't hear it again. And the two men are like so frightened by whatever this was. It certainly didn't feel like a bear. They had not smelled something like that. They had certainly not heard a sound like that. And just the way it was moving, it was so agile and so huge and did sound like something that was walking sort of upright. Like even just the steps it was taking right outside their lean-to, it didn't sound like a typical animal moving around. This was different. And so the two men, they're terrified and they're just up all night, waiting for this thing to come back. By the time the sun finally rose the next morning, Smith was so anxious and so exhausted that he actually felt sick. He didn't want to leave the campsite because this trip was ultimately about making money and they had not caught any beavers yet, so this was not a profitable trip yet. But if they left now, they definitely wouldn't be catching anything, and this really would be a net loss. However, both he and Bauman both agreed that, whatever kind of creature here kept coming back to their campsite, it certainly did not act, walk, or sound like a bear. Whatever it was, clearly it was dangerous. So ultimately, what Bauman and Smith decide to do is they are going to basically wrap up this trip early, but first, they're going to go check all those beaver traps they had set, both around the pond and up the hill next to that stream. But normally they would do this together, and it would take a really long time to go to each and every trap and check it, and if there was a beaver in there to work through that. So what they decided to do instead, in order to be expeditious and be really quick, is they would split up. It's broad daylight. They figured they were safe here from whatever this creature was, and they would split up, they would divide and conquer, check all the traps, and then meet back at the campsite before it was dark, pack up, and leave. A little while later, Bauman had finished checking all the traps that he was responsible for, and he had come back with 3 beavers over his shoulder, and he was feeling pretty good. He was pretty quick checking his traps. He's thinking, great, our plan's gonna work. I bet Smith is done too. We can pack up and get out of here, hopefully really soon. And so he's walking towards the campsite and he can see it up ahead. And at first glance, everything looked to be in normal order. The lean-to was still set up and he could see there was some gear stacked up on the ground. And so as Bauman got closer to the camp, he began calling out to his friend, to Smith. And Smith didn't call back. Now, Bauman didn't really know if Smith was actually back to the campsite yet. He could still be out checking his traps. So Bauman, he walks into the campsite and Smith is not there. But that gear that he saw from a distance sort of stacked up in the middle of the campsite, well, it was Smith's gear, and he had packed it all up and stacked it there, which certainly suggested that Smith had finished checking his traps, had packed his stuff, and had to be nearby, like he was getting ready to leave too. And so Bauman's thinking, okay, I just gotta find him. Maybe he walked off somewhere as he's waiting for me. And so Bauman, he puts his beavers down and continues calling out for Smith, just sort of wandering around, the rough vicinity of the campsite, hoping to find Smith. But Smith never calls back. And Bauman's getting a little worried. Again, they're obviously on edge here. Some weird things have been happening here. That creature obviously totally freaked them out. And so, Bauman is yelling louder and louder, and he's sort of moving faster and faster, trying to find some sign of where Smith went. And at some point, Bauman makes his way into that clearing where the night before, Smith had actually found those tracks that showed, this bipedal creature moving around. And when Bauman made his way into that clearing, he just stopped. Because the first thing he saw is there was blood all over this clearing. It was like a bloodbath everywhere. And then on the other side of the clearing, sort of draped up against this tree, was like this heap of meat. That heap of meat was Smith. Smith had been absolutely ripped to shreds. Like his body was just destroyed. His limbs were all in different directions. Like he was ripped to pieces. And I mean, Bauman, he didn't even have to go over to check to see if he was dead. He was definitely dead. There's no creature in the area. It's totally silent, eerily silent. And Bauman, like, he's just staring at his friend, wondering, like, what does he even do? But as he's standing there staring at this just horrific scene, something else clicked. If it had been an animal that attacked his friend Smith, if an animal was responsible for this, it likely would have eaten Smith, or there would have been signs that Smith was eaten by this animal. But Smith had no signs of predation. Smith had no signs that an animal was trying to eat him. His whole body was just ripped apart, like whatever killed him just wanted to kill him and basically fling him around like a toy as he was being killed. And so at this point, almost like instinctively, Bauman knew two things. One, the creature clearly killed Smith. There was no other explanation that made sense here. He didn't understand, why or even how, but the creature had to have done this. And two, the creature was not a bear. Couldn't have been a bear. There's too many obvious signs that what they're dealing with here is not a bear or really any animal he had ever run into. And then also, sort of a third thing was, Bauman's thinking, I wasn't that far away. Like this horrifically violent attack, it sort of happened silently or just fast enough that, Smith didn't have time to scream. It's like this creature killed almost surgically, despite the sort of gratuitous nature of the scene. And so all that said to Bauman is he needed to leave right now. And so he literally left his friend, he left all the supplies, he just turned and fled. Over the next several decades, Bauman just lied about what happened to Smith. He told people that while they were out there, Smith was attacked and killed by a bear. And the reason he did that and did not tell people that, well, it was some bipedal monster that, wandered the woods and slaughtered my friend, the reason he didn't say that is because he felt like nobody would believe him, that he would look crazy. And that, of course, like he's feeding into this rumor that this particular area is cursed and there's a monster out there. He just didn't think people would take him seriously, so he kept it to himself. That was until about 40 years later when Bauman met this man that he felt like he could trust with his real story. This man was an avid hunter, and he was collecting unique stories for a book he was writing about wilderness exploration. And to Bauman, it felt like his story was a fit. So Bauman told him the truth. He told him all about, what they experienced out there and, the fact that he did not believe it was a bear. He felt like it was a monster, if you will. And this man who's hearing this story took Bauman really seriously. He took detailed notes as Bauman was recounting this, horrific thing, and then he ultimately published Bauman's account in his book. In the book, the writer described this creature that Bauman and Smith encountered in the woods as, quote, something either half human or half devil, some great goblin beast. Now, to modern audiences, when you hear the details of the story, the one I've just shared with you, I mean, the monster really sounds an awful lot like Bigfoot, or at least something Bigfoot adjacent. But the writer published this book, published Bauman's account, in 1893, which was more than 60 years before the term Bigfoot even existed. So today, Bigfoot believers cite this book, in particular, Bauman's experience, as one of the very first documented accounts ever of a monster that is now ubiquitous. But the writer of this book did not go down in history as, being remembered for documenting Bigfoot essentially for the first time, or at least before anybody knew, what Bigfoot was. No. Instead, the writer would go down in history for what he did 8 years after publishing that book. That was when he was elected as America's 26th president. The writer was Theodore Roosevelt. Moscow, Russia, which is one of the world's richest cities, is home to more billionaires than any other European city. But if you travel just 10 miles south of Moscow's richest neighborhood, the Golden Mile, you will reach one of Russia's poorest neighborhoods, the southern Moscow suburbs. Nicknamed Jopamira, which means the asshole of the world, these suburbs used to be a thriving neighborhood with tens of thousands of working-class Russians and their families calling it their home. But after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the money and the jobs in this area dried up completely, and even though the residents wanted to relocate and live somewhere with more opportunity, they couldn't. They didn't have the resources to leave, and so they were trapped. And since 1991, really nothing has changed in these suburbs. Today, there are still tens of thousands of now very poor Russian families that still live there, living in these totally overcrowded Soviet apartment buildings that are these big, square, identical-looking things that are literally falling apart. And most of the people who live in these suburbs either are unemployed or they work some dead-end job that barely pays them any money. The police in the suburbs are completely underfunded and, for the most part, are corrupt. And so crime over the years has really taken a dramatic uptick. Also, drug and alcohol abuse are completely running rampant in this part of the world. But despite their notoriously rough living situation in the southern Moscow suburbs, these residents do have one claim to fame, and that is the Bitsevsky Park. Bitsevsky Park is comprised primarily of a massive, lush green forest that is full of wildlife and beautiful streams and clearings, and it sits right on the southern edge of the southern Moscow suburbs. In total, the park covers a whopping 2,700 acres and stretches 4 miles from top to bottom, which makes it 3 times bigger than New York City's famous Central Park. Bitsevsky Park had always been a popular tourist destination for people living around Moscow, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, the park's popularity skyrocketed, specifically amongst people that lived in the southern Moscow suburbs. As their lives continued to become more bleak in the 1990s, they compensated by going to the park as much as they possibly could. They would take long walks in the woods, they would play chess with their friends along the peripheries on the park benches and tables, or they'd go cross-country skiing in the winter. Basically, year-round, this park became their escape from their miserable everyday lives. But that would not last. Starting in the early 2000s, something totally unexplainable and terrifying began happening in the park, specifically in the heavily forested area in the park. And eventually, this unusual event that was taking place got so completely out of hand that the residents of the southern Moscow suburbs stopped going in the park. They were literally too scared to go inside. The strange phenomenon began in 2001. From May to July that year, 10 people went missing after having been spotted either in or right around the outside of the heavily forested area inside of Bitsevsky Park. All of them were alone when they were last spotted, and all of them were men. Now, there was some precedent for people suddenly going missing in this part of Russia. Every now and again, people would try to flee these suburbs to try to make a better life for themselves somewhere else, but time and time again, they would just come back a couple of days or weeks later because it hadn't worked out. But when these 10 men did not come back in a couple of days or weeks, their families went to police and reported them missing. But unsurprisingly, the police did not launch an investigation. Instead, they accused the 10 missing men of just being drunk bums who probably wandered off somewhere, and whatever trouble they were in, it was their fault. Now, the families and the locals did not buy this explanation, but there really wasn't a better explanation. These men really had just kind of vanished. No one had any idea where they went. And so given the kind of general grim outlook on life that lots of people held in this area, people just kind of accepted that whatever happened to these 10 men happened and there's nothing any of us can do about it. And they moved on. But in October of that year, so 2 months after the 10th man had gone missing in the park, another man went missing in the park. And then by the end of the year, 4 more men had vanished inside of the park. And all of them vanished under the same circumstances, last spotted alone in or around the heavily forested area in the park. The families of these 5 men would go to police. They would report their family members missing. But again, the police did not launch any investigation and blamed the missing people for being responsible for whatever happened to them. And then after that, the families kind of mourned the loss of these 5 men, not really sure what to make of it. And locals kind of gossiped about it for a little while and started to speculate about what might have happened to them and kind of lumped them in with the 10 other men that had gone missing. But after a while, when no new news came out about what happened to them, everyone just kind of moved on again. And unbelievably, this pattern would repeat itself for nearly 4 years. From 2002 to late 2005, 25 more people would go missing inside of Bitsevsky Park. 24 of them would be men, 1 of them would be a woman, although it wasn't clear if she was actually in the same category as the other 24 men, but regardless, that put the total number of mysterious disappearances inside of this forested area in the park up to 40. But still, the police shrugged it off, and eventually, so too did the local population. Everyone just kind of moved on, like this phenomenon wasn't happening, that people were not going missing in droves inside of this forest. But everything would change with missing person number 41. Because unlike the previous 40, this missing person would be found again. 63-year-old Nikolai Zakharchenko was a retired police officer who lived in a tiny apartment in the southern Moscow suburbs with his family. He was a classic Russian tough guy who chain-smoked cigarettes and drank lots of vodka. And even though he was well aware of the missing person phenomenon inside of this park, that wasn't about to stop him from doing the thing he loved, which was going on walks inside of this park. He figured whatever was out there, he could handle it. So one evening in November of 2005, Nikolai told his sister that he was going to go out for a walk in the park. But that night, he didn't come back, and so his family was very worried about him, but they decided they would wait until the next morning to see if maybe he showed up. But the following morning, when Nikolai did not show up, his family went to the police. But per usual, the police did nothing. A few days later, a local was walking fairly deep inside of the forest inside of Bitsevsky Park when they noticed well off the trail, off to the left side, there was something unusual kind of tucked in the underbrush. Now, this local was all alone. They had kind of a bad feeling about whatever this was, and so they called the police and they reported seeing something strange. And surprisingly, the police did actually come out and they went over to investigate, and they found this unusual thing was Nikolai Zakharchenko. He was lying face down, he was fully clothed, and he only had one injury, but it obviously had been fatal. He had a massive hole on the back of his head. This was not from a gunshot. This was from massive blunt force trauma. He had been struck so hard that literally the back half of his skull was blown clear off. The police searched the area in hopes they might find the murder weapon or some other clue as to what happened to him, but there was nothing. And so all the police could deduce was that Nikolai had obviously been attacked either by a person or group of people or even an animal, and that whoever his attacker was or whatever his attacker was had clearly snuck up on him, given the location of his injury. Now that the police had a body, and it likely looked like it was a murder, they could no longer ignore the fact that so many people had gone missing inside of this park, and it was looking like probably if they looked around the park, they might find more bodies. So the local police called in reinforcements from Russia's Criminal Investigation Department, and they came to the southern Moscow suburbs, and with the local police, they began searching every inch of this park looking for more bodies or just for any indication of who or what was behind this attack and behind all these missing people. But after several days of a very extensive search where they looked everywhere in this park, all over the forested area, they found nothing. At the same time this huge police search was going down inside of Bitsevsky Park, news about Nikolai's death had spread amongst the southern Moscow suburbs, and people were now getting really scared. Before, the fear of the park felt kind of theoretical because there were no bodies. And so even though it seemed far-fetched, it did seem possible that maybe all these people were getting lost on their own, that they really were just drunks stumbling off. But now, with the discovery that one of these missing people had been horrifically killed, that made the danger associated with this park feel very real. And so it was around this time that most residents of these suburbs stopped going inside of this park in fear of whatever was out there in the forest. And they would forbid their children from going in, and they would tell their neighbors, don't go in the park. And they gave this evil thing that lurked in the forest that caused men to disappear and attacked Nikolai, they gave this thing a name. They called it the Bitsevsky Park Maniac. But despite the fear of this maniac causing so many people to avoid this park, and despite the massive police presence that was in the park constantly looking for bodies, looking for clues, and just generally patrolling the area, despite all that, people still continued to go missing in this park. Starting just a week after the discovery of Nikolai's body in November of 2005, all the way up to April of 2006, 9 more men would mysteriously vanish in the forested section of Bitsevsky Park. And just like Nikolai, just a couple of days after they were reported missing by their families, they would be found lying out in the middle of the park with the backs of their heads caved in. But unlike Nikolai, most of these 9 victims had been found with a glass bottle jammed into the hole in the back of their head, meaning almost certainly this was the work of a human, not some animal. By this point, almost no one was stepping foot inside of the park, because it was basically common knowledge that, a serial killer is obviously on the loose in the forest. But despite this, there were still some very stubborn people who continued to go inside of the park. And one of those people was 32-year-old Alexander Pichushkin. He had been born in the southern Moscow suburbs, and he still lived with his family in the same tiny apartment he had grown up in. It's safe to say Alexander's life had been more difficult than his peers. When he was just 4 years old, he fell backwards off of a swing, and when he sat up, he was okay, but the swing came swinging back and smashed him in the front of the head, causing brain damage. Now, his family did not have the money to send him to a hospital, and so when he stood up after getting struck and he was kind of able to walk around and he seemed okay, they determined he was fine and they didn't follow up. But Alexander was not fine. The injury had impaired his cognitive abilities, and years later, when he went to school, the other kids would bully him for sounding dumb. By the time Alexander was in high school, he felt like an outcast. He didn't have any friends, and he was miserable. But his grandfather, who lived in the same apartment complex as he did, he noticed this about Alexander, and he decided he would take him under his wing and he would look after him. And so the first thing he did is he asked Alexander to come over, and he taught him how to play chess, believing that would be something they could bond over. And when he taught Alexander the rules of this game, which are quite complicated, it was like it opened up the secret portion of Alexander's brain that had never been opened before. Alexander immediately absorbed all this information about chess and became a master of it practically overnight. Within a couple of days of being taught how to play, he was beating his grandfather virtually every time they played together. And so his grandfather was totally thrilled about this and was very proud of Alexander. And so he decided to bring Alexander down to Bitsevsky Park, where all these old men who were total chess masters were always playing chess on all of the park benches and tables. And so he brought Alexander down there and he put him up against all of these incredible players, and very quickly Alexander was wiping the floor with them. And they loved him for it. He was their star. He was their prodigy. They totally adored him and they respected him. And when they found out he was getting bullied at school, they made a point of telling him that he would always have a place with them in this park. And so for Alexander, this was like the best moment of his life. He finally felt like he was accepted and he finally felt happy. And so over the years, even after Alexander's grandfather passed away, Alexander continued to go down to Bitsevsky Park to play chess virtually every day. And he kept going to the park to play chess, even when men began going missing in the park, including some of the men he played chess with. And Alexander continued going to the park to play chess, even after bodies began piling up in the park. Alexander's mother was terrified for him and felt like he didn't understand the risk he was putting himself in by going to this park all the time. But every time she pleaded with him not to go, just take one day off from playing chess, Alexander would say, "Mom, I'm gonna be fine." And then he would leave anyways. In April of 2006, Alexander was 32 years old and worked for a local grocery store stocking shelves. By this point, at least 50 people had vanished mysteriously in the forested section of the park, and 10 bodies had been found. On the morning of the 12th of that month, Alexander showed up to the grocery store for his shift, and right away he noticed there was a new employee. It was this beautiful older woman he had never seen before, and Alexander, while he was confident playing chess, was not remotely confident around women. He had never had a girlfriend before. But he found himself looking at this woman across the store, feeling like she was different, that she was more approachable than other women. And so he told himself that day he was going to go up to her and he was going to say hi. And so all through his shift, he kind of awkwardly watched this woman from a distance, kind of building up his confidence. And then at the end of his shift, her shift was also ending, the pair walked outside at the same time, and Alexander was about to say something, but he just couldn't find his voice. And then he noticed this woman had put a cigarette in her mouth, but she was fishing around for her lighter, like she couldn't find it. And so Alexander jumped into action and pulled his own lighter out, and he held it out to her and said, "Hey, can I light your cigarette?" And so before long, the two were chatting and they were walking together and smoking their cigarettes. And over the course of their conversation, Alexander would learn this woman was named Larissa Kollegina, and she was 48 years old, and she lived near Alexander's apartment. And so after they walked for a little while, they arrived in front of her apartment building, and at this point, Alexander knows she's about to go inside, and so he suddenly feels bold, and he asks Larissa, "Hey, do you want to continue walking around with me for a bit and maybe do a pass through the park?" Now, at this point, the Bitsevsky Park was totally not a place you would bring people to. This is a place that everyone in the area is basically terrified of. But for Alexander, Bitsevsky Park was like his happy place. And so naturally, if he's going to take a woman on a date, that's where he's going to bring her. And surprisingly, Larissa was very quick to say, "Oh, let's go to the park." And so the two, they lit up another cigarette and they walked across the road and they walked through the front gates of the park. Their first stop was the chess tables along the periphery of the park, right outside of the forest. And the tables were totally empty. But at this point, that wasn't surprising given the fact that even amongst diehard chess players, really Alexander was the only one still willing to go back in there every single day. And so after seeing where Alexander spent all of his time, it seemed like it was time to turn around and leave. But neither Alexander nor Larissa wanted their date to end, and so they decided to light up another cigarette and then follow a walking path that kind of looped into the forest and came back out again. And as they entered the woods and got deeper and deeper into the forest, the chess tables that were behind them faded from view, and the sky began to get darker and darker as it was getting late. But the pair just kept on walking, maintaining their cheerful conversation. But at some point, as they talked and walked, the path below their feet stopped looking like the path they had originally set out on. Now they're stepping over broken logs and they're ducking under low-hanging branches, and it's not really clear if they're on a marked trail anymore. But neither of them bring it up. They just maintain their kind of light conversation and continue walking as if nothing's going on. However, they both definitely began walking faster and faster to maybe speed up this loop. But at some point, when it was very obvious they were no longer on a path, they both came to a stop. As they had walked, Alexander had been in front, and so when they came to a stop, he turned around and he looked at Larissa, and right away he could tell there was just something wrong about her. There was a look on her face that just didn't look right. She looked exhausted or sad or something. And then as he's looking at her, she inexplicably kind of collapses into a tree right next to her, and she grabs the tree with her arms and she slides down to its base and she presses her cheek and her chest up against its bark and she begins to cry. Alexander has no idea what's going on, so he just stands there staring at her. And in between sobs, Larissa looks up at Alexander and says, "You're the maniac, aren't you?" Alexander couldn't believe it. She was the first person to figure it out so quickly. Normally,
he would have to tell his victims before he killed them. And so he smirked and he looked at her and he said, "Yes, I am." And so Larissa, at this point, she lets out this huge sob and she looks down and she keeps crying. And then she looks back up again at him and she says, "Are you going to kill me?" And without any hesitation, Alexander looks at her and he says, "Yes, I am." And then he reached into his jacket and he pulled out a hammer. No one knows for sure why Alexander became a serial killer or why he almost exclusively targeted men. Many people believe it might have something to do with the brain damage he suffered as a 4-year-old when that swing hit him in the head, that somehow that rewired his brain and made him more aggressive towards other people, especially men. But that's just speculation. And other than that injury, there really isn't much in Alexander's life that stands out as a big red flag. He just kind of floated about his life and followed the crowd. But in 1992, when he was 18 years old, he got this urge to kill and he actually decided to act on it. He brought up this desire to a classmate of his named Mikhail Odachuk, and surprisingly, Mikhail says to Alexander, "I want to kill someone too. Let's do it together." And so the two met up a couple of days later and they headed off to Bitsevsky Park and began walking around the forest looking for a lone person that could be their victim. And as they're walking along, Alexander, he's fully committed, but he can tell Mikhail is not. He's starting to get cold feet and he's talking about, maybe let's stop for now and head back and maybe do this another time. And Alexander, he's getting more and more angry and frustrated with Mikhail until finally Alexander decides, my first victim will be Mikhail. And so he turns to Mikhail and he says, "You know what? If you want to head back, you can." And Mikhail says, "Okay, maybe we can do this another time, right?" And Alexander says, "Sure." And so Mikhail turns around, and as soon as his back is to Alexander, Alexander pulls out his hammer and he smashes Mikhail in the back of the skull, causing Mikhail to crumple to the ground, either dead or unconscious. But either way, he's laying on the ground. And as soon as he is, Alexander remembers that they had passed a little while earlier this well kind of hidden in the middle of the forest. And so he grabbed Mikhail's body and he dragged him through the forest over to this well. And when he got to the well, he pulled the lid off of it, and then he picked Mikhail's body up, pushed him up and over the edge, and dropped him inside. And Mikhail fell 30 feet all the way down to the icy water below. And then Alexander put the lid back on the well, he grabbed his hammer off the ground, and he left. An important part of Alexander's killing was this well. This well was not a drinking water well. It was basically an access point to this deep underground sewer system that stretched all around the underside of this park. And so when Mikhail fell down this 30-foot shaft, he didn't just land at a pit of water right at the bottom of the well. Instead, he fell all the way down the shaft until it opened up like the bottom of a huge scientific beaker. It was basically like this big cave at the bottom of the well that was full of very deep water. And so Mikhail would have splashed into that water, which was icy cold, and then after Alexander put the lid on top of the well, it would have been pitch black inside of that space. Now, even if it had been lit up, there was no ladder for Mikhail to climb back out of. And there was a current running through this well because there were tunnels leading into it and then out the other side. And so Mikhail, if he woke up, if he was conscious when he hit the water, he would have immediately been swept into another tunnel. And many of the other tunnels that led away from this cave space were completely filled with water. And so he would have had nowhere to breathe. He would have been sucked into a tunnel and he would have drowned. And so whether Mikhail died from the strike on the back of the head or whether he drowned, we don't know. But he died after being thrown in the well. And then his body was swept miles and miles away to some deep underwater recess where nobody was looking. Alexander would wait another 9 years before he killed again. But once he started up again, he didn't stop. His first kill after the hiatus was in the summer of 2001. His victim was a man he liked to play chess with. In fact, this was a man that loved Alexander and was definitely one of Alexander's friends. They regularly played chess with each other. And one day in May, after a game of chess, Alexander asked the man if he wanted to head into the forest to pay respects to his dog, who he had buried out in this forest. And he told the man he was going to have a sip of vodka over his dog's grave. And so this chess friend of his agrees to go with Alexander because he loves Alexander Alexander, he's a good friend of his, and says, absolutely, let's go pay our respects to your dog. And so the pair begin walking into the forest, and at first they're on a trail, but eventually Alexander says to this man that you need to leave the trail in order to get to the gravesite. So the man says, yeah, no problem. And so they get off the trail and they're walking for a little while until they reach the well. And when they get to the well, Alexander stops and he kind of points to some arbitrary spot on the ground and says, oh, that's where my dog was buried. And so Alexander pulls out a bottle of vodka and he takes a swig, and then he hands it to the man, who does the same thing to kind of do this commemorative drink for this dog. And then afterwards, Alexander looks at his friend and kind of gestures with his arm to get the man to, take them back out of the forest, back out to the chess tables. And so the man turns around and begins backtracking. And as soon as he does, and his back is to Alexander, Alexander pulls out his hammer, he walks up behind his friend, and he smashes him over the back of the head. And then just like Mikhail, he drags this man's body over to the edge of the well, he pulls the lid of the well off, and then he lifts this man up, and he dumps him into the well shaft, and then he puts the lid back on top. Alexander continued to lure his victims out to that well, and all of his victims were people he knew. They were his chess friends. They were his neighbors in his apartment complex. They were anyone he had a personal relationship with. He would later say that that was his preferred victim. He liked to know the person he was killing. It made him feel like God. Amazingly, it would turn out not all of Alexander's victims who were chucked into that well actually died. Victims number 16 and 17, who were a pregnant woman and a 13-year-old boy respectively, after they had their heads smashed with a hammer and they got chucked into the well, their clothing got caught on a snag poking out of the inside of that 30-foot shaft, and it literally arrested their fall and kept them from plummeting all the way into the water. And somehow, in both instances, Alexander didn't notice. He just put the well lid back on and walked away, believing they were both dead. But they weren't, and after they regained consciousness, they were able to kind of claw their way back up the well shaft and pulled themselves out of the well. Both victims would go to the police, and both of them would positively identify who their attacker was, Alexander. But the police didn't care. In fact, they told both of these victims that they needed to drop the charges and leave them alone. And if they didn't, they, the police, would come up with something to have both of them arrested, the victims. And so Alexander got away with it, and the victims were literally intimidated by the police to stay quiet. And so that led to dozens and dozens more murders. In April of 2006, after Alexander told Larissa he was the maniac and he was going to kill her, he walked behind her as she cried and continued to hold on to the tree, and he wound up his hammer and brought it smashing into the back of her head. And then as she slumped to the ground, he hit her several more times in the back of the head with the hammer, and then he pulled out a vodka bottle and he jammed it inside of the hole, and then he left. 2 months later, Alexander would lure another woman out into the middle of the forest with him. Her name was Marina. She was 35 years old, and she had met Alexander while working at the grocery store with him. She actually was hired to work at the grocery store to fill Larissa's now vacant spot. Before Alexander and Marina began their walk out to the park, which was Alexander's suggestion, Marina said she just needed to stop by her apartment to let her son know where she was going. And so they swung by her apartment. Marina went upstairs and she left a note for her teenage son saying where she was going and who she would be with, and she even left behind Alexander's name and his phone number on this note. And so when she came back out again and she and Alexander began walking towards the park, Alexander knew that if he killed her, which was his intention, that he would certainly be caught. The police were on super high alert at this point, and they would certainly get their hands on this note, and that would absolutely implicate him, and so he didn't really know what to do. But by the time they were strolling into the forest, Alexander had decided he was going to kill her anyways. And many people believe he did this specifically to get caught, not to protect the public from himself, but because he wanted fame. He wanted recognition for what he had done. This theory stems from the fact that starting with his 41st victim, Nikolai Zakharchenko, Alexander began leaving his victims' bodies out in the open. He stopped putting them into that well. And he wouldn't just leave them out in the open. He would prop them up in strange poses against trees, and he would jam glass bottles into the holes in the backs of their heads, indicating he wanted the police to find them. That way, he could get all the credit credit he believed he deserved. When the police did finally arrest Alexander, they searched his apartment and they found this notebook. And in this notebook was a picture of a chessboard. Now, a chessboard has 64 squares on it, and in Alexander's notebook, this chessboard had 62 of the 64 squares filled in. And Alexander would explain to police that that was his scorecard. He had 62 victims. It would turn out 2 of those people had actually survived, the pregnant woman and the 13-year-old boy, but still, there were 60 murders accounted for in this notebook. Alexander would be fully cooperative with police and would tell them every detail he could possibly remember about every single killing, including what conversations were like with the person he killed right before he killed them. He would also often reenact what he did to the person and how he felt afterwards. It was very clear that Alexander was reveling in the attention he was getting from law enforcement, and it was very clear that he loved talking about killing. Ultimately, the police were only able to gather enough evidence to charge Alexander with 49 murders, not 60. And when Alexander heard this, he was totally disappointed, and he asked the judge if he could get credit for the other 11 murders to maintain his 60-victim mark. The judge said no. During his trial, Alexander was deemed to be such a threat, he was kept inside of a glass cage the entire time. And during the proceedings, he showed no remorse and in fact seemed kind of happy, like he was enjoying the spectacle of his trial. He was ultimately given the harshest penalty under Russian law at the time, which was life in prison without parole, and the first 15 years of his life sentence would be in complete and total solitary confinement. So virtually no human interaction, kept inside of a cell 24 hours a day with nothing in his cell all day long. Alexander is still alive today, and he is still in solitary confinement. In Nigeria, motorcycle taxi drivers are called Okadas, and in Ibadan, which is one of Nigeria's biggest cities, home to 3.5 million people, there are a lot of Okadas. However, despite their massive numbers, these Ibadan Okadas are actually a fairly tight-knit community made up primarily of young men. And so in early 2014, when 2 of these Okadas went missing, the community immediately found out about it and was really concerned. And when the police did not appear to be doing much to actually go out and find these 2 guys, the community of Okadas decided to launch a search of their own. Basically, as they went about their day, driving around the city, dropping fares off, all of these Okadas would be going down side streets and looking in back alleys and checking all over the city for their missing members. But despite their best efforts, they never could find them. Then, on March 22nd of that year, a 3rd Ibadan Okada vanished. He was a young man named Lanre Sidiku, and unlike the other 2 riders who went missing while they were at home, Lanre went missing while he was working. Lanre was part of a group of Okadas within the city who all kind of met up on the same city street, and that's where they stayed throughout the course of their day, trying to wave down fares as they came up. And so everyone in that meetup point all knew each other, and so they all knew Lanre. And on the day he went missing, they recalled seeing him driving away from this meetup point with 2 passengers on the back of his bike. Now, typically, the rides these Okadas would offer to their passengers were very short. They're only driving them just around the city. And so it was very quickly noticed that Lanre had left and after several hours had still not come back yet. When it was noticed by the other Okadas, they began talking about it and someone said, give him a call, make sure he's okay. And so they called his cell phone and Lanre did not pick up, which was highly unusual, not just for Lanre, but amongst the other Okadas. They always had their phones on because they're looking for new customers and customers could be calling them. And so their cell phone is a vital part of their work. And so his phone is off. They don't really know what to make of that. And then out of nowhere, Lanre actually calls this group of riders. However, he was calling them on his second cell phone. Lanre would keep a work phone and a personal phone. So he was calling them on his personal phone. And so when this other Okada answered the phone and heard Lanre's voice, he put the phone on speaker so the others who were concerned could hear what was going on. And what they heard was Lanre, totally hysterical, screaming into the phone that he needed help. He said that he and 8 other people he was with who he didn't even know had been kidnapped, and their kidnappers had brought them to this underground prison cell. They couldn't see anything, but they could hear people walking above them. Lanre also explained that when they had been kidnapped, the captors had taken all of their belongings, but they hadn't recognized that Lanre had this secondary cell phone, which is why he was calling from it. And so in between Lanre's frantic descriptions of what was going on and what had happened to him, these Okadas that received this call, they can hear in the background these other 8 people that are with Lanre in this underground cell screaming out as loud as they can, probably to get the attention of someone, anyone who was above ground who might be able to come down and save them. And so these Okada riders who are getting this call from Lanre, they're horrified, and they're trying to calm Lanre down so he can explain where he is so they can go find him. And finally, Lanre, he does compose himself, and he gives them really specific directions to this footpath that led into the Soka forest where he said he had been taken. The Soka forest was a very dense stretch of wilderness right on the outskirts of Ibadan. Lanre would tell them that he had no idea where specifically in the Soka forest he was. However, he said, if you just keep walking on that path, eventually you'll hear us calling out from underground and you can come and save us. And so as the riders turned on their bikes and they got ready to head out and go rescue their friend, they told Lanre to stay on the line. Let us keep talking to you until we find you. But as they're telling him that, his phone abruptly cuts out. And then when they tried calling him back, his phone was off. About 40 Okadas from Lanre's meetup spot took off together and sped down city streets until they hit this major highway that would take them out of the city. And then once they were out of the city, they went down this other road that brought them right towards the Soka forest. And then as this road put them right up against the tree line on their left side of the Soka forest, they all began looking for the 2 burned out cars that Lanre had said marked the beginning of this footpath they were looking for. And so sure enough, they find these burned out cars, they park all their bikes off on the shoulder of the road, and they quickly realize that this really is a footpath only. There's no way they can get their motorcycles onto the path, not only because the burned out cars are blocking their way, but because the path itself is so overgrown with vegetation. I mean, they can barely see the path, let alone drive something through it. And so the men leave their bikes by the side of the road, and then unarmed, they walk past the burned out cars onto this path, and then because it was so narrow, they had to walk more or less in a single file line into the Soka forest. And so as these men are basically marching into the woods, they're not making any sound because again, they're trying to listen for the sound of their friend and the other people that have been taken captive somewhere underground. And so they're silently marching through this forest when all of a sudden the guy at the front of the line thinks he hears something way up ahead. And so he holds his hand up to stop the line, and they all stop and they're trying to listen. And then all of a sudden, about 50 feet ahead of them through the trees, this man they didn't recognize suddenly jumped out from behind a tree. He yelled something at them, and then he raised his gun and began firing in their direction. The 40 Okadas immediately turn around and just sprint back down the path, right back out to the road. They hop on their bikes and they peel back out towards the city. When they finally get back to the meetup spot they had all originated from, they realize they can't just leave Lanre and the other people he was with out to dry. They have to go back and rescue them. They considered calling the police, but given the lackluster response to the other 2 missing Okadas, they realized they probably would have a higher chance of saving their friend and the others if they just went themselves. And so the 40 Okadas rounded up another 60 from other neighboring meetup spots, and this huge posse of over 100 men all hopped on their bikes and headed back towards that footpath that led into the forest. When they got there, they put their bikes on the side of the road, and this time, when they started walking down that path, they had guns, knives, bats, all sorts of weapons, and they were not trying to be quiet. They were actually yelling like these loud war cries to let the gunmen and any other gunmen in the woods know that there was a horde of angry people that were coming into the woods for a fight. And so as they're marching down this trail, kind of expecting to get shot at any point, It doesn't happen. Instead, after quite a while, they walk out of the thick forest into this huge opening. And right in the middle of this huge clearing is this fairly small river, but it's big enough that it would be very difficult to cross. However, they can see there's a bridge, this kind of crumbling old stone bridge that goes over this river. And then on the other side of the bridge, on the other side of the river, they can see there are two dilapidated buildings. The one that is closer to the bridge is this small black shack that has a window looking out towards them. And from their perspective, they're maybe 100 feet away from the shack. They can't tell if anybody's inside of this building. And then the other building was much bigger than the shack. It was this huge kind of broken down warehouse that had big, tall cement walls. And then all around it was this huge chain link fence with barbed wire wrapped around the tops. And so this huge posse of Okadas, they come storming out of the forest and they run over to that bridge, which is the one way across. And as they get on the bridge, they're kind of scanning the two buildings. They're not seeing anybody. And then one of the men, they look down underneath the bridge and they actually see Lanre's motorcycle. It's lying on the banks of this river, kind of tucked up underneath the bridge as if someone had stolen it. And so everyone already knows Lanre is somewhere over here. We're going to go find him. And so the men, they get over the bridge, they go to that first building, that black shack, and they open up the door. It's a plywood door and there's no one inside, but the shack is literally stuffed full of hundreds and hundreds of articles of clothing and shoes. And so after kind of looking this over and not really sure what to make of it, the posse moved on from the black shack and made their way up to the fence right in front of this huge warehouse. And when they reach the fence, they're kind of expecting to be met with some sort of resistance. I mean, the last time they were out here, they got shot at. And so they begin yelling into the warehouse for anyone in there to show yourselves, come out here. But it was silent. And so one of the Okadas that was part of the posse had brought along bolt cutters as a weapon to use as a club if he needed to. But as it happened, he began to use the bolt cutters for their actual purpose. And he bent down and actually cut a huge hole in this fence so they could go in and explore this warehouse. And so after a large percentage of this posse had gotten inside the fence line, they began walking around this huge warehouse to try to find an entrance inside. And so as they're walking, the windows that lead into this warehouse, they're too high up, so you can't actually see what's going on inside. It's silent. There's a pretty bad smell, but they don't really know what to make of this. They walk around the structure, and when they get to the very back, they find an entrance. All it is this big rusted piece of tin metal, like sheet metal, that's propped up against a gap in the walls of the warehouse. And so one of the Okadas grabs this piece of metal and he pushes it out of the way. And then as soon as he did that, a few other Okadas quickly stepped through the threshold into the warehouse, preparing themselves to have to fight potentially if there are gunmen or anybody else inside that might want to do them harm. But as soon as they see what is inside of this warehouse, they immediately lower their weapons and just stare in abject horror. According to the locals who lived actually in the forest relatively near where this warehouse was, they said there was actually another way to get to this particular area, to get to the warehouse. There was another path that was very rough, but it was big enough for one vehicle that came in from the other direction. Now, the locals said they didn't use this path at all. They didn't even know where it originated from. But they said for the last 10 years or more, they have seen one vehicle use this road all the time to get to the warehouse. And it was this black Jeep with black tinted out windows. And they said it would typically show up most nights of the week around 8 p.m. And they said it would just go down the road. It would make its way over to the warehouse area. And then around 9:30 p.m., they would hear or see the black Jeep leaving. Now, none of the locals knew who was driving this Jeep, although they knew it was a man. That was really all they knew. And they had no idea what this man did when he got over near the warehouse. However, for the last 10 years, every time this guy was over near the warehouse from 8 to 9:30 at night, they would typically hear screams coming from that part of the woods, coming from the warehouse. And when the locals brought their concerns to police, the police just kind of blew it off and didn't do anything about it and actually told the people, don't worry about it. And so over the years, the locals had kind of just accepted that this man in his black Jeep and the screams coming from this warehouse were just a part of life. And so no one even reported it anymore. Had the police followed up on the locals' concerns about this Jeep and the screams, they would have discovered that that warehouse was actually a storage facility for a very in-demand and very illegal product. And that man who drove that black Jeep, he would take this illegal product and he would bring it back with him in batches and he would sell it on the black market. When this posse of 100+ Okadas pulled that metal door aside and they stepped into the warehouse, they were not met with any resistance. Anyone that had been there, any other gunmen or guards or anything like that, they had fled when they heard the sound of this massive posse whooping and yelling on their way in. And so as these Okadas are standing inside of the structure surveying what's in front of them, the first thing they noticed is right in the middle of the structure on the ground is this cement slab. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet, and one corner of this slab was elevated slightly by some rocks that had been placed under it, kind of propping it up, pitching it on an angle. And then just off of the side of the lowest point of the slab was this wooden bowl that had dark stains inside of it that was positioned in such a way that if you put water on the slab, the water would drain off of that corner directly into this bowl. Basically, it was there to catch any runoff from whatever was happening on this slab. Around this cement slab, all over the dirt floor, were bones, some with meat on them. And then beyond the bones and beyond the slab, all around the perimeter of the inside of this building were extremely malnourished, catatonic people chained up to the walls. These people were the highly in-demand, highly illegal product. More specifically, their body parts were the product. In Nigeria, a stunning number of people believe that certain magic potions and charms will grant you wealth and success, and in some cases, infinite life. But the catch is, the herbalists who will perform the magical rituals and give these potions and charms to people that pay for them, they often require human body parts for them to work. And so human body part factories, like this warehouse in Soka Forest, were established in order to meet the high demand of people that needed these parts. And so the way it's believed it worked at the Soka Forest warehouse was the man in the black Jeep. He would get orders from people that wanted specific body parts for their magical potions and charms and whatever else they needed, and he would make a list of those parts, and then at 8 p.m. he would show up at the warehouse and he would communicate with the people that worked at that warehouse, and they would determine out of all the captives they had who had the parts they needed. And then after figuring out which captives were going to be used that night, they would go into the main section of the warehouse, and one by one they would unchain these people, they would drag them to the center of the room, and in full view of all the other captives, they would put them on the slab, known as the slaughtering slab, and they would hack off the required body parts and would bag them up, put them in coolers, and then the man with the black Jeep, he would take those parts and he would leave. And then the person who's just been butchered, if they were still alive and might have a chance of surviving, they'd just be brought back to the wall and chained up again. If they did not have a good chance of survival, then they'd be brought to the very back of the warehouse in the back rooms where they would be discarded. Now, the means of execution varied, but in the back rooms of this warehouse, they found a makeshift guillotine, which cuts off people's heads, and they also found a large crocodile that was chained up. And so it's likely that those were at least two of the methods used to discard of the people they could no longer harvest organs from. After the Okadas kind of broke out of their initial shock of what they were seeing inside of this warehouse, they went around and began freeing people that were still chained up to the walls. And in total, there were 23 people that were still barely alive, still inside of this warehouse, but none of them were Lanre Sadiku. And then after checking all of the dead bodies and body parts that were inside of the warehouse, and then also right outside, where there were a number of shallow mass graves, they couldn't find Lanre amongst them either. And so this huge posse began looking all over the property for an entrance to this underground prison that Lanre had described being in. But they couldn't find it, and so eventually this posse made their way back over to the survivors who were being tended to by locals that had come over, and they asked the survivors, are you aware of any underground prison cells somewhere around here where other people were being held? But the survivors either didn't know or just were unable to speak anymore. And so later that day, when the police did come out, because word got out about this huge find out in this forest, the posse went to the police and begged them to please begin digging digging up this entire property. We need to find the entrance to this underground prison cell. Lon Ray and 8 others, and who knows how many others beyond them, are trapped underground in these cells, and we got to get to them. But the police just kind of refused and immediately just demolished the warehouse. And then after kind of cordoning off that area for a couple of days, the police basically just left and stopped caring about it altogether. And so the Okadas once again came together as a community and would spend the next several weeks going back out to this forest and just manually begin digging up all over this entire property in hopes of finding their friend and the rest of these people that were trapped underground. But they never did. And so we don't know what happened to Lon Ray and the other people who were trapped in that underground cell. We don't know what happened to the other 2 Okada riders who went missing right before Lon Ray did, although it's generally assumed they most likely were kidnapped as well and probably met a similar fate. We also have no idea how many people were butchered inside of the Soka Forest warehouse. However, given the massive amount of clothing and shoes inside of that black shack, it's believed the total number of victims is easily in the hundreds. No one has ever been officially held accountable for the atrocities that took place in the Soka Forest. However, a couple of days after the warehouse was discovered by the Okada posse, the posse was back digging, looking for Lon Ray, when they discovered there was this man who was there who was kind of walking around acting suspicious. And so the posse confronted him, and it would turn out this guy had several human tongues in his pockets, along with dozens and dozens of cell phone SIM cards. And so, assuming he was part of whatever happened there, the Okada posse proceeded to kill the man on sight. Later on, a woman who was a survivor from the warehouse would tell reporters how she got kidnapped. She said she lived in Ibadan, she was well educated, she had a good family, she was just sitting outside of her house when all of a sudden this van pulled up in front of her, and these very official looking men were inside of this van, and they got out and they told her, you know, you're under arrest, you gotta come with us to the police station. And the woman was so confused, but the men were very professional and seemed very convincing, and so she got inside the van, they shut the door, and they drove off. And very quickly, once she was inside of the van and couldn't go anywhere, she realized they were not police, she had been kidnapped, and within the hour, she, along with several other people who had probably been kidnapped in the same way, were stripping their clothes off right outside of that black shack on the other side of the river, and they were told to put their clothes and belongings inside of the shack while they were being held at gunpoint, and then once they were naked, they were promptly marched into that warehouse where virtually everyone around her would be butchered and killed. Located on the far northern tip of Maine, right on the border of Canada, lies a small rural town called Van Buren. Van Buren is home to about 2,000 people who, for the most part, have lived in Maine for their entire lives, and they tend to be very rugged and very competent people. But unless you live in Van Buren or know someone in Van Buren or have family out there, there's no reason you would have heard of this particular town. Nothing really happens in this town, at least nothing that makes headlines. However, that would change. In 2019, Van Buren made international headlines because of one man, Ronald Sear. As a young man in the 1950s, Ronald Sear joined the Air Force and fought in the Korean War. And then after he got out of the military, he moved back to his hometown of Van Buren, Maine, and he moved into a very modest 2-story home right near town. And for a little while, he just kind of floated about, didn't really have a direction in life. But eventually, because of his love for working with his hands and his general skill at working with his hands and building things, he started a small but successful tool selling company that he ran right out of his shed on his property. Fast forward to 2019, Ronald Sear at that time was 65 years old, and he still lived in the same property right near town in Van Buren. However, he now lived alone, and he still ran this tool selling business right out of his work shed. And for Ronald, this was enough. He was very content with his life. He was very happy. But that year, he would face a crisis. One bright, sunny morning in the summer of that year, Ronald left his house and he walked over to his shed. He went inside, and right away he noticed something. Ronald kept all these bins inside of his shed that were full of all of the different tools that he would sell. And because he was in there all the time, either literally selling tools or tinkering with whatever it was he was building himself, he was very aware of how full each of these bins were. And anytime they got low, he would order order more so he had enough supply to sell. And so he went into his shed this morning and he noticed right away that a couple of the bins appeared to be a little bit lower than he remembered. And right away, Ronald is thinking, did I forget to order supplies to fill these bins up? Did I just forget to do that? But he's thinking to himself, I am meticulous in making sure my inventory is full at all times. I've been doing this for decades, and so it can't be me. Maybe I took the tools and I brought them into my house and I've left them in there, or maybe they're in my truck. And so Ronald, believing there's a totally logical explanation for this, would leave his shed and he would search his property, but he can't find these tools anywhere. And so he began calling his family and his friends to see if, maybe they had come by and borrowed some of these tools, or maybe they knew what had happened to them. But everyone he spoke to said, no, I have no idea. And so by that afternoon, Ronald had found himself back inside of his work shed looking around, thinking to himself, have I been robbed? It was the only logical thing he could think of that would explain this loss. And so Ronald drove to the police station and he spoke to police and he explained what happened. But unfortunately, the police's reaction to what he was telling them was not exactly what he wanted. They basically assumed that, he just had miscounted, that in reality, the tools were either still in the shed and then he just forgot how many were supposed to be in there, or he had just kind of lost them on his property somewhere, that they were bound to turn up. And so the police told him, look, Ronald, go back and search your property. I'm sure they're there. And if you get some proof that someone actually stole from you, then come back to us. And so Ronald was really annoyed by this. He wanted them to take this seriously, but he could tell they just were not going to. And so Ronald drove back to his house. He went inside, he hopped on his computer, and he began researching what other homeowners did to protect themselves from things like theft. And one of the things he came across was setting up tripwires all around the perimeter of your property. Basically, you take these thin wires and you stretch them out very tight, very low to the ground, and you anchor them on each side, and then on the wire itself, you hang little bells. And so in theory, if an intruder were to walk onto your property, they would most likely not see the tripwires on the ground and they would kick them, and that would cause the bells to ring, thereby alerting the homeowner of their presence. Ronald loved this idea, so he went out and he set up tripwires all around his property. But over the next several days after these wires were stood up, none of the wires made any sound, and still more tools continued to go missing. This was also in spite of the fact that his shed was locked at night. And so Ronald's thinking to himself, whoever's doing this is clearly watching me and kind of monitoring what I'm doing. They must be aware of the tripwires, and they must be sneaking into the shed, at some time that I have the doors unlocked. I mean, this is a professional thief. And so as Ronald is thinking about this master thief that is targeting him, he has this sudden fear that if he can't stop this person from breaking into his shed and taking his tools, how can he possibly protect himself against this person breaking into his home and stealing things from in there, which included all of his cash and many other valuables? And so Ronald became very fearful and decided the only thing he could do was really beef up his home security system. And so he hopped back online and he began Googling other ways to protect your property. And after discovering a number of really effective techniques, he got to work. He began building all these home defense systems and placing them all around his property. And after all of these kind of DIY security measures were put up, the theft of his tools stopped. And in Ronald's mind, that validated that his defense system had worked. He was effectively preventing theft. But this would not be the end of his troubles. Fast forward to Thanksgiving that year, so November 28th, and the Van Buren police got a very frantic phone call from Ronald. He was totally hysterical, he wasn't really making sense, and the police, they tried to understand what was going on, but all they could get from Ronald was that he was requesting police to come to his residence immediately. And so the police, they hang up and they're thinking, okay, we know Ronald was dealing with a potential thief. Maybe he literally caught the thief red-handed and he wants us to come and arrest this person, and who knows, maybe they're fighting at his residence right now. And so the police speed over to Ronald's house, they pull into his driveway, and at first glance, nothing looks out of the ordinary. Ronald's truck is in the driveway, and there's no obvious signs of a disturbance, but they notice the front door to Ronald's house is wide open. And so the police park their cars in Ronald's driveway, they get out and they run up onto the front porch, and they're standing in front of this open door, and they look down and they can see there's a very obvious blood trail starting from from the front of Ronald's house, going straight back down a hallway that looped around to the left and out of sight. And so right away, the police are yelling into the house, "Ronald, Ronald, are you okay? What's going on?" And somewhere deep inside of the house, they hear what sounds like Ronald make a kind of guttural sound. And so immediately this tips the police that more than likely Ronald has been hurt, and he likely is the one who made this blood trail. And so the police draw their guns and they go inside of Ronald's house, not really sure what they're going to find. They don't know if there's some intruder or attacker or someone in here that's harmed Ronald, but they make their way down this hall following the blood trail. They turn the corner, and then sitting at the end of the blood trail is Ronald. He's sitting down with his back to some cabinets in the kitchen, and he's clutching his midsection. He is covered in blood. He's completely pale. And so right away, the officers call in backup, but then as a security measure, they search the rest of the first floor to make sure there is no other person here. There was no one on the first floor. They went to the second floor. They peeked around up there. They didn't see anyone. So they rushed back down to Ronald, who's still just sitting there, and they begin administering first aid, and they're trying to get him to explain what happened. How did you get hurt? But Ronald is clearly in shock. He's kind of in a daze. He's not making sense. And then by the time the paramedics showed up, just a couple of minutes later, Ronald had slipped into unconsciousness. When Ronald was wheeled out of the house, the responding officers and the backup officers, who by now had arrived, decided to search the rest of Ronald's house to see if there was some clue as to what had happened. And so they began searching in the kitchen, looking around, but there wasn't anything that stood out to them. And then they began walking around towards the living room. And when they got into the living room, one of the officers suddenly screamed to everyone inside to stop where they were, stop moving. It would turn out Ronald, as part of his very beefed up home security system, had installed various booby traps all around his property, including inside of his house. And some of these traps were gun booby traps. The officer that had yelled for everyone to stop had spotted one of these traps. He saw a handgun anchored to the ceiling aimed at the front door, and there was a string attached to the trigger that was also then attached to the doorknob of the front door. And so if this trap were live and some person opened the front door, it would activate this trap, causing the gun to shoot them. And so clearly Ronald had accidentally left this particular booby trap on, and he had accidentally activated it, shooting himself. And so after the officer sees this gun anchored to the ceiling, he tells everyone, and they begin looking up and just looking around to see if there are other traps. And amazingly, there are. In other doorways, just from where they're standing, they can see the barrels of guns pointing down that are obvious booby traps. In their haste to get in there and figure out what was going on, they hadn't noticed all of these guns in the ceiling, and so it was just kind of a miracle that none of the other traps had been set off. Ronald would be rushed to the hospital that night, but he would pass away from his wound. His death would be ruled an accident, and to this day, we don't know if he really was dealing with a professional thief that was stealing his tools, or if it was just a figment of his imagination. Mary Cerruti had a difficult childhood. Growing up in the 1950s and early 1960s in Houston, Texas, Mary's family barely had enough money to get by. And then by the time Mary was 21, both of her parents had passed away, leaving her with nothing. After their deaths, Mary kind of bounced around Houston, going from one low-paying job to the next, and then eventually she met a man that she fell madly in love with, and they got married, but unfortunately that marriage would end in divorce. After Mary got over that heartbreak, she would meet another man who she would also fall in love with, and they would get married too, but like her first marriage, this one also ended in divorce. At this point, Mary was so devastated by yet another heartbreak that she just kind of accepted that she was not gonna get married again. She was not gonna have a family of her own. But she didn't let this get her down. Instead, she kind of embraced her life as a loner. Fast forward to 2015, and Mary was 61 years old, and she was still living alone. She lived in a small home in a Houston neighborhood. This neighborhood, over the last several decades, had really begun to grow. Lots of new apartment complexes were being built all the time, and in fact, one of the apartment developers had approached Mary and offered to buy her house so they could build over her land, but she had refused because she loved her house. She did not want to sell it. It didn't matter what they offered her. And so she was the only house in this long stretch of apartment buildings that didn't sell. But Mary kind of liked it. She wrote in her diary that her bungalow was like a castle, and all these apartment buildings all around her were her castle walls. Mary didn't really have much contact with other people. She didn't have a consistent job, so she didn't have relationships with coworkers. She didn't have much contact, if any, with her living family, and she really didn't have any friends, with the exception of one woman who was in town who owned an arts and crafts shop, who Mary would periodically go into town and say hello to. But despite all that, Mary was not lonely. She had lots and lots of cats, and she loved cats. Anytime she saw a stray cat out in the neighborhood, Mary would get the cat food and water, and then eventually would try to coax the cat to come into her house. And then when it did, she would win the cat's trust, and then she would give it a place to live, and she would feed it and take care of it. And so before long, she had dozens of cats living in the house with her. And so these cats kind of became Mary's best friends, and so she rarely left the house, if ever. She mostly just stayed in the house with them. In February of that year, one of Mary's neighbors happened to be walking by her property, and they looked over and they saw a stack of mail had grown on her front porch, indicating that Mary had not opened her door to get her mail. And this neighbor also noticed that while Mary's property did tend to get a little bit overgrown with the trees and the grass, it was exceptionally overgrown, like no one was even trying to take care of it. And so this neighbor was concerned that maybe something had happened to Mary, and so they opened up her fence, they walked across the yard, they went up onto the porch, and they knocked on the front door, but it was silent. And so this neighbor kind of leaned over and looked in the window that was just to the left of the door to see if maybe they could look inside, but there was a curtain drawn across that window, so they couldn't see anything. And so the neighbor tried knocking on the door one more time, but again, met with silence. And so after standing there for a minute, the neighbor left the front porch and walked around to the side of the house to see if maybe they could look in one of those windows, but when they went around to the side, those windows were covered with curtains too. So the neighbor walked back to the front of the property and just stood there looking at the house, wondering what they should do. And something told them that something's off, something's wrong, someone needs to make sure Mary really is okay. Someone needs to get inside of this house. And so the neighbor called the Houston police and explained the situation. A few minutes later, the Houston police arrived, and they too went right up onto Mary's porch. They knocked on her door. It was met with silence. And so after that, the police talked to one of the other neighbors and got a key that Mary had apparently given them previously. And the police went back to Mary's front door. They used the key. They unlocked the door. They opened it up, and right away they were hit with this horrible smell coming from inside the house. The police pushed the door the rest of the way open, and they stepped inside and they yelled out for Mary, but it was silent. And then before the police even began walking around looking for her, they looked off to their left and the right inside of the house, and they saw there were all these dead cats all over the ground. And so the Houston police didn't know what happened to Mary, but right away they're thinking, okay, we've seen scenarios like this before where someone who lives alone that no one really checks on dies unexpectedly, and then when they pass away, all of their pets are trapped in the house, they're not getting fed, and so they pass away too. And so the police at this point are fully expecting to find Mary's dead body somewhere in the house. And so they begin walking through the house looking for it. But after searching the house top to bottom, they could not find Mary. And so the police leave Mary's house, and at this point there are people outside gathered because they see the police cars. And so the police grabbed a couple of the neighbors and they asked them, do you know anything about this woman? Did she say anything about where she was going? Did you see her leave at any point? And the consensus amongst the neighbors they spoke to was that Mary basically kept to herself. She did not travel. She didn't go anywhere. She mostly just stayed in her house with her cats. And so it was very unlikely that she would have just abandoned the property and abandoned her cats because she loved them so much. And so the police at this point are thinking, okay, she's got to be in this house somewhere. And so the police called a few more officers to the property, and the group went back inside of Mary's house, and they really looked for Mary, thinking that, maybe she slipped into a closet and that's where she passed away, or, maybe she's just hidden somewhere in the house. And so they really kind of ripped the house apart looking for her. But again, there was just nothing. And so after they finally stopped the search without finding Mary, the police contacted Mary's extended family and they asked them the same questions. Did Mary say anything about a trip she was going to take? Is there any reason she would just abandon her property? And they all would say, look, we don't talk to Mary. We don't know where she went. We have no idea. And so for a little while, the Houston police continued to search for Mary in and around Houston. but eventually, after finding nothing, the search kind of stopped, and they reached out to Mary's family and said, if you hear anything else about what happened to Mary, please let us know. Several months later, Mary's house went into foreclosure because no one was making the payments anymore, and the bank put her house up for auction. And a real estate entrepreneur in Houston bought the house up quickly, and after cleaning it out, he put it on the market to be rented out. And for the next couple of years, several tenants lived in Mary's old house, none of them staying for very long. Then in March of 2017, when the property was vacant, this young couple reached out to the landlord and said they were looking to rent, and they were hoping to potentially stay in this property for 2 or 3 years. The landlord was thrilled, and he sent over a lease for them to sign. And then once the couple had signed the lease and the property was theirs, the husband decided to just go over on his own and walk around the property and see what they would need to buy in terms of furnishings. And so the husband arrives at the property, he goes in the front door, he walks around the first floor, and then at some point he decides he wants to go up into the attic to see how much storage space they have. And so he gets underneath the trap door in the ceiling, he grabs the string and he pulls it down, revealing this folded up ladder. He flips down the lower ladder piece and puts it on the ground, and then he began climbing up. Once he got up into the attic, he stayed standing on the ladder and just kind of scanned around, and he saw there really wasn't much up there. There was a couple of metal cages that appeared to have been for pets or something, but it was very dirty and dark, and it appeared like no one had really come up here in a long time. And he kind of assumed that, the other tenants weren't using this as a storage space. And so the husband was about to go back down the ladder when he noticed off to the right side of the attic, kind of far away from the ladder, right where the roof begins to pitch down, he saw one of the floorboards was kind of popped up, like it shouldn't be. And he stared at it, and he's looking around at the rest of the attic, and all of the floorboards were perfectly uniform, but that one was really jacked up. And so he was curious, and so he climbed up into the attic, and he kind of stooped down, and he walked over to this loose floorboard, and when he was standing over it, he could tell that this floorboard had kind of popped off of this hole in the ground, that the floorboard had been covering this hole, but the hole was dark. And so he pulled out his phone, and he turned on his flashlight, and he looked straight down, and he aimed the light into this hole. Now, this hole was basically just a gap between two of the walls on the first floor. And so he's shining his light down into this gap, and he sees at the bottom the remains of the woman the Houston police have been looking for the past 2 years. Mary Cerruti. While no one knows for sure exactly what happened to her, it's believed back in early 2015 when she went missing, she had gone up into the attic where perhaps her cats liked to sunbathe off to the side of the attic because there was a big window that looked into the attic. And so she went up there to maybe feed the cats or check on the cats that were up there. And when she walked over to that side of the attic where the window looked in, she stepped on that loose floorboard and it gave out from her weight, and she kind of fell through it like a trap door and fell down into that gap between the walls. It's unlikely she was hurt from this fall, but when she stood back up again in this kind of narrow space, she would have realized very quickly that there was nowhere for her to go. You can't go left, you can't go right, and you can't get back up into the attic. It was too far up for her to reach, and there was no way for her to kind of use the walls to climb back up because the space she was in was so narrow. I mean, she could barely move. She also didn't have a cell phone on her, so she couldn't call anyone. If she screamed out, no one would have heard her because she was behind several walls of insulation. And because no one ever checked on her, there was no one that was just going to find her trapped in the wall. She was totally on her own. And so trapped in this little space, Mary spent probably a couple of days screaming and trying to get her way out, but nothing worked. And then eventually she passed away. And then unfortunately, all of her cats did too. Her death was ruled an accident. In the spring of 2017, Antonio Navarrete was on top of the world. Just a year earlier, the 21-year-old Florida resident had met the love of his life, a young woman named Daisy Martinez. And now Daisy was pregnant, and so she and Antonio were very excited about starting a family together. For the time being, Antonio and Daisy were living with Antonio's parents in his hometown of Waimama, which is a quiet rural suburb just south of Tampa. But Antonio had a bright future ahead of him. Ever since he had graduated high school, he knew what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to be an auto mechanic, and he had the skills to do it. From the time he was a toddler, he had always been obsessed with cars, breaking apart his toy cars and putting them back together. And then as he got a little bit older, he began drawing these very intricate drawings of cars that he loved or designs for new cars. And then when he was a teenager, he began actually tinkering around with real cars. until he finally acquired a car of his own. It was a white Chevy lowrider pickup truck that he tricked out with all these fancy lights and special rims and this huge sound system that took up most of his back seat. It was thanks in part to this truck, which he nicknamed Casper, that Antonio, who was too shy to be much of a ladies' man, met up with Daisy in the first place. Antonio had driven Casper to a local car meetup for other car enthusiasts, where you could basically park your vehicle and you could walk around and see what other people did to upgrade or enhance their vehicles. And so while Antonio was there, he was walking around when he saw on the far side of this meetup, there was this unbelievably beautiful young woman, and he found himself just staring at her. He couldn't help it. And this young woman, who was Daisy, she eventually would look up and she would smile at him, and the rest, as they say, was history. 6 months later, not long after Daisy had moved in with Antonio at his parents' house, and the couple had announced to their delighted families that they were going to have a baby, Antonio got yet another good piece of news. He'd landed a good job with a company that did maintenance work for Tampa Electric Company's Big Bend power plant, which was located in Apollo, Florida, which was about 10 miles to the east of Antonio's parents' home. Now, this was not Antonio's dream job. He still very much wanted to eventually become an auto mechanic, but this job paid $12 an hour, nearly double what he was used to making. And so with this job, he and Daisy would finally be able to raise enough money to get a place of their own, hopefully before the baby arrived that fall. Also, Antonio had been told by other people who worked at this company that this was actually a really easy job, that pretty much you just rolled around on golf carts all day picking up trash. It was perfect. A few weeks later, on June 24th, Antonio found himself driving in his truck to the Big Bend power plant for his first day on the job. As he drove, he would have glanced over at the picture of Daisy he had taped to his dashboard. She was the only woman he had ever loved besides his mother. When Antonio arrived at the Big Bend power plant, he was totally amazed at just how enormous this thing was. It was basically this huge factory that sat right up against the water, and there were 4 huge smokestacks coming out of the ceiling of this factory with white smoke billowing out of them. This plant produced electricity, and they did this by burning coal. This process was done in 4 distinct units that were inside of this factory that Antonio was looking at. And each of these units is comprised of a humongous boiler, which is basically a 12-story tall oven. And so coal is loaded into this huge boiler, and it burns at the bottom of the boiler, creating some steam. And that steam goes up the boiler and begins to turn these huge turbines, creating the electricity. And then the steam just continues up the boiler and then out its respective smokestack into the air. In newer units, the airborne ash, which is a natural byproduct of burning coal, is captured inside of the boiler. But at Big Bend, 3 of their 4 units were built in the 1970s, so they were older models, and they did not capture the airborne ash inside the boilers. Instead, the ash would get heated up so much that it would melt and turn into a substance called slag, which basically is molten lava, like the stuff that comes out of volcanoes. That's what slag is. And so as this slag kind of builds up inside of the boiler, it would go through this man-sized hole at the very bottom of the boiler, and right below that hole is this 30-foot tall water tank called a cooling tank, and this red-hot slag, it basically dumps down into that water, which cools it off, turning it into these kind of glassy rocks. And then they settle at the bottom of this 30-foot cooling tank, and at the bottom of the cooling tank is this grinding mechanism that pulls these hardened, cooled off little boulders of slag into it, and it crushes them up and spits them out on the other side as little tiny bits of slag chips. And then these chips get sold for use in everything from sandpaper to roofing shingles. So after Antonio had spent several minutes just admiring this gargantuan building he would be working in, he gathered up his things, he hopped out of his truck, and he headed toward the front doors. That day, and the next couple of days, were very uneventful for Antonio. He basically just sat in a break room and watched videos about safety and training, and then when he wasn't doing that, he was out trying to navigate around the inside of this huge factory, which was basically this huge maze. And he found very quickly that it was a very hazardous place to work, as there were huge trucks moving around inside of it, it was super loud, and there was just heavy machinery operating constantly all around you. But after several days of just kind of walking around and and asking people what things were, Antonio felt like he had a pretty good handle on the layout and also on what his job would entail. On Thursday, June 29th, so just 4 days into doing this new job, Antonio woke up in his parents' house in a really good mood because the next day, that Friday, Daisy was going in for an ultrasound and they were going to find out whether their baby was a boy or a girl. And he was very excited about this. And so Antonio came downstairs, he grabbed a quick bite to eat, and then he kissed Daisy on the cheek and he headed outside into his truck and began the commute to work. A few hours later, Antonio's mother was in the grocery store when she pulled her phone out of her purse and she noticed Antonio had called her and she missed it, but he had left a voicemail. And so she played the voicemail and then put the phone to her ear. And what she heard was quite possibly the most traumatic thing a mother could ever hear from their child. After leaving the house that morning, Antonio drove all the way to work, no problem. He parked in the lot, he went inside the building, and initially the day was like any other day. He just kind of drove around the facility and picked up trash, and that was it. But just a couple of hours into his shift, two fairly significant issues arose simultaneously inside of Unit 2. In the boiler, the slag that was building up had somehow created a sort of plug over that man-sized hole where the slag was supposed to dump into the water chamber. And so as more and more slag was being created as the ash melted, it wasn't draining into that chamber, and so all of this slag was just building up on top of itself inside of the boiler. And then in the water chamber, completely unconnected from the issue in the boiler, the slag that had fallen into the water chamber, that had cooled and settled at the bottom, it had landed in such a way that it actually blocked the grinding mechanism. And so none of the cooled slag boulders and rocks were being ground up and expelled out the other side. And so they needed to fix these two issues quickly, otherwise Unit 2 would become basically ineffective. Now, the safe way to fix these two blockages would be to start by turning off Unit 2's boiler. And then once it was off, you could drop dynamite into the boiler itself and break up the blockage over the man-sized hole, and you could send a team into the water chamber after you drained it to chip away and move the blockage over the grinding mechanism. However, turning a boiler off at a power plant is extremely expensive. And so the Tampa Electric Company decided, you know what, let's just have them fix these blockages without turning the boiler off. And so at 4 in the afternoon, a senior plant manager rounded up 5 other employees, which included Antonio, to come with him and do these repairs inside of Unit 2. And so the plan was to empty all the water from the cooling chamber of Unit 2, and then once it was empty, they would open something called the doghouse door, which is on the outside of the cooling chamber towards the bottom. They would open that up, giving them a line of sight into the bottom of this cooling chamber where that grinding mechanism was, where all those slag rocks had kind of come to a stop on top of it, and they would fire water cannons into the bottom of this cooling chamber to attempt to dislodge these slag rocks off of the grinding mechanism. And then after they cleared that blockage, they would shut the doghouse door and they would somehow deal with the blockage inside of the boiler. But that felt like a secondary issue. They needed to make sure the grinding mechanism was cleared before they did anything else. Now, you need to understand that this company had asked their employees to do this type of repair before, to do it with the boiler still on, and in the past, nothing bad had ever happened, and so these 6 guys, including Antonio, must have thought this was just totally routine, that we would never be asked to do something like this if it was extremely hazardous. But it would turn out what they were doing, making these repairs with the boiler still on, was quite possibly the most hazardous thing they could possibly do at this plant. But either way, the 6-man team made their way over to Unit 2, and they began taking up positions with their water cannons right in front of the doghouse door. Antonio's job for this operation was actually not to be involved in getting the slag free. He was just going to be there to clean up during and after the operation. And so he stood kind of in front of the doghouse door, but maybe 10 or 15 feet back, just kind of standing back, watching the other guys do their jobs. Now, you need to understand the scale of the machinery involved in front of Antonio and these other men. You have the water chamber, which is 30 feet tall, and then above the water chamber is the 12-story tall boiler that is still on. So there's coal actively burning inside of it. There's red hot slag, so like lava, just kind of tumbling around inside of it. And the steam inside of this boiler is well over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And so they are dwarfed by this totally dangerous piece of machinery. But eventually, their operation begins. The senior plant manager has the water chamber drained, and then after it's empty, they open the doghouse door, and Antonio watched as the other 5 men took turns with their water cannons, firing them through the store at the big slag rocks that are sitting on top of the grinding mechanism. And it wasn't really working that well, but they were starting to make some progress, and Antonio likely was just kind of getting bored waiting for this to be over, because there really wasn't much for him to do. There wasn't much cleanup. And then as he's standing there, something horrible happened. Because the boiler had been left on, all that ash was still getting melted and turned into slag. And the slag was not being drained because that plug had formed over the man-sized hole in the boiler. And so you have all this slag that's building up. It's getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And about 20 minutes into their cleanup operation, the weight of all that slag broke through that plug, immediately creating an opening where all this red hot slag, this lava, came tumbling down. It rebounded on the back end of the empty water tank and shot out of the doghouse door like a tidal wave of hellfire. And in seconds, thousands of gallons of this lava-like substance was all over all 6 men. It was like a wave going over them. And then after the slag hits the ground, they were all standing in 6 inches of basically lava that stretched in 40 feet in any direction. Now, unlike trying to run in, let's say, mud or deep water where you're just kind of moving slowly, every step you take in this slag, basically your foot melts into the slag. So with every step, your shoe melts, then your skin melts, then your bones melt into this substance. And so all these men, after immediately being hit with this stuff and catching on fire, literally, they likely tried to start running, but it was like their bodies were slowly consumed by this slag feet first. And so Antonio tried to run like the rest of them, but he couldn't go anywhere, and he fell onto the slag. So he's laying on his side, and as he's melting and burning to death, he reaches into his pants pocket with his free hand, and he pulls his phone out and he calls his mother. She doesn't pick up, and so he leaves her a voicemail, and all he says is, "Mom, I'm burning. Please call the cops. Please, Mom." And in the background of this voicemail, all you hear is the hissing sound of the steam and slag pouring out of the boiler. In total, 5 of the 6 men that were a part of this repair operation would be killed from this tidal wave of slag. Antonio would be one of them. Tampa Electric would end up paying out a settlement to each of the families of the deceased. Cranbrook, which is a small snowy town in British Columbia, Canada, used to be a place no one had heard of. Then Isaiah Otieno changed that. In 2006, an 18-year-old smiling young man named Isaiah Otieno stepped off of a plane in Cranbrook and began making his way toward the baggage claim. As he walked, everyone in the airport stopped and stared up at him. Isaiah was 6'9" tall, and he was from Kenya, making him easily one of the most unique people in all of Cranbrook. Isaiah, who was the son of a Kenyan politician, had worked really hard to earn his slot at the local university, called the College of the Rockies. His plan was to use that degree to get a great job so he could help support his family back in Nairobi. Not long after the first semester of Isaiah's freshman year had started, he was not only flourishing academically, but also socially. His big smile and his charm and his incredibly good manners had earned him many friends, as well as the nickname the Gentle Giant. But the person Isaiah most closely bonded with while he was in Cranbrook was another student named Isaac Hockley. Isaac, in addition to being a student at the College of the Rockies, was also a passionate photographer and actually worked part-time for the local newspaper as a freelance photographer. Isaac and Isaiah had briefly met in late 2006 at their campus's billiard halls when they were both playing pool, but that interaction had not made them friends. What had cemented their friendship and made them very, very close was one night in early 2007, Isaiah had gotten a job as a bouncer at a local bar because he's 6'9", and so he was the bouncer. And Isaac had come to that bar, not to see Isaiah, just to go to the bar. And so Isaiah's at the front, he's checking people in, and then he hears this commotion in the bar behind him, and he turns and he sees Isaac is getting attacked by this huge guy that's way stronger than him, who looked like he was the aggressor in the fight. And so without any hesitation, Isaiah turns and just starts galloping into the bar. He's leaping over chairs, he's leaping over tables, and he jumps into the fray, and he fought off Isaac's attacker. And so after the dust settled, Isaac was so thankful for Isaiah, even though Isaiah kind of downplayed it and acted like it was no big deal. But either way, the experience totally bonded these two very different people, and after that, they became totally inseparable. Over the next couple of semesters, the pair would often go off on long rides outside of Cranbrook into the mountains and the forests, and they would just chat. Isaiah would talk about what it was like to live in Kenya and how he was really here to try to be successful like his father. And Isaac would talk to Isaiah about his passion for photography and what it was like growing up in Canada around Cranbrook. On one very memorable drive, the pair were driving at night along this kind of winding road that went through a forest when all of a sudden a moose leapt onto the road and blocked their way. And so Isaac at the last second had to swerve to avoid the moose. But ultimately, they did not get into an accident, and it was just a close call. So Isaac was totally fine. He had kind of recovered within seconds of getting past the moose. But Isaiah, who was in the passenger seat, was totally shaken up by it. And when Isaac started talking to Isaiah about why he was so shaken up, because after all, they are fine, they did not get into an accident, Isaiah would admit that he wasn't shaken up because they almost got into an accident. He was shaken up because he saw a moose. He didn't know moose existed, and so seeing this enormous creature suddenly in the middle of the road right in front of them just had totally spooked him. And so after this, Isaac loved to bring this story up as a way of kind of making fun of Isaiah for his fear of moose, but it was totally in a loving way, and Isaiah would always laugh right along with him. But despite how well everything was going in both Isaiah and Isaac's lives to that point, everything would come crashing down in 2008. On May 13th, 2008, so 2 years after Isaiah showed up in Canada, Isaac got a phone call from his employer, the local newspaper, who told him he needed to head into town to take some pictures of a crash that had just happened. A helicopter had been flying over Cranbrook conducting a power line survey when they had lost power and crashed. And all three people, the pilot and the two people in back who were actually doing the survey, they all died on impact. Isaac, like everybody else who heard about this, was totally shocked. One, because it was totally tragic and horrible, but two, because nothing ever happened in Cranbrook. So to have something so big like this happen right downtown was just unheard of. And so Isaac hopped in his car and he began making his way towards the crash site. And it didn't take long before he saw this massive ring of people right at the intersection between 10th and 14th Street. They were all on the sidewalk and up on buildings, and everyone's just looking in towards this massive mound of jagged metal that was on fire, and all this black smoke was coming off of it, and there's ambulances nearby and police, and the fire department was there, and they're trying to put out the flames, but they can't do it. And so Isaac parks his car and he rushes over to this ring of people, and he works his way towards the front. He pulls out his camera and he began taking pictures, first of the wreckage and the fire, and then also of the police as they put tarps over the bodies. Little did Isaac know, these pictures he was taking were about to take on a whole new significance for him. Earlier that day, just before 1 p.m., Isaiah wrapped up his final class of the day, and after he was done, he remembered he had some letters in his backpack that he had been meaning to mail to his family back in Kenya. And so he decided on his way home, he would make a detour to the post office and he would mail those letters. And so he left the building where this final class was, and he stepped out into the bright sunshine of that May day. He put his headphones on and then he began to walk. At about 1:05 p.m., he arrived at the post office and he went inside just long enough to put his letters in the mail slot, and then he headed back outside. 1 minute later, at 1:06 p.m., as he was crossing 10th Street, the helicopter above lost power and crashed directly on top of Isaiah. Within seconds, he and the three people on board the helicopter would all be dead. It's believed because Isaiah was listening to music on his headphones, he didn't even hear the helicopter as it was crashing down. He was just walking, and then he was dead. It was a total freak accident. It wasn't until later that day that Isaac would realize the pictures he had taken of this scene included pictures of his friend. Before we get into our next story, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, HelloFresh. Back when I was 18 years old, I discovered my favorite food. I would dump an entire sleeve of Oreo cookies into a bowl and slap a quarter gallon of milk on top of them. Back then, this nutrient-dense power breakfast gave me enough energy to get through another grueling day of playing video games while remaining unemployed in my mother's basement. But today, being a mid-30s guy, my body just doesn't respond the way it used to Oreo sleeve cereal. So in recent years, I've had to work really hard to reduce my Oreo sleeve cereal intake to where it only makes up a paltry 75% of my total diet. And what I do with that massive 25% of my diet is I fill it with tasty and healthy foods like you can get through HelloFresh. HelloFresh sends you amazing food right to your doorstep. However, the catch is the meals aren't made yet. You need to make the meals. But the recipes are so easy to follow, and they perfectly pre-portion everything out when you get it, so it really is super easy. HelloFresh also has a huge menu, including vegetarian, pescatarian, fit and wholesome, so whatever your goals are, HelloFresh makes it easy to stick to them. They also have a really good spring menu that just came out that's getting rave reviews. So if you want to be like me and stop sucking down so much Oreo sleeve cereal, then you gotta sign up for HelloFresh today. To do that, go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen16 to get up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Okay, back to the stories. On a warm summer night in 1998, a 7-year-old boy named Tyler Florian fell asleep watching TV on his living room couch. Tyler lived with his parents as well as his older brother, Will, who was 10 years old, in a modest 2-story home in a rural neighborhood in West Virginia. That night, Tyler's father, who normally tucked the boys in at night, was out for work. And so after Tyler fell asleep, it was his mother who gently woke him up and encouraged him to head upstairs to his room. And so Tyler, he gets off the couch and he's groggy and he makes his way over to the stairs. He climbs up the stairs and he turns right and heads down the hallway to his room. He goes into his bedroom, he climbs into his bed, and then he falls asleep. In order to understand what happens next, you need to have a good understanding of the layout of the second floor hallway. That hallway stretched from the front of the house all the way to the back of the house. And at either end of this hallway were doors that led outside of the house, and these doors had big windows on them. The front of the house, that door, if you walked out it, you'd be walking out onto a balcony that overlooked the front yard of the property. But if you walked out the back door of this second floor hallway, you would not be walking onto a balcony. You would not even be on the second floor. You'd be basically stepping into the backyard of the house. And the reason for this is because the house was built into a hill. And so the back half of the house is literally underground. It's in the hill. And so there is no door on the lower half of the house because there's just earth behind the door. And so it's that second floor doorway at the end of the hall that serves as kind of like the exit to the backyard of the house. So with that in mind, Tyler, he gets upstairs, he goes to his bedroom, which is towards the front half of this hallway, and he falls asleep. And then only about an hour after falling asleep, he wakes up to the sound of someone using the bathroom. Tyler's bedroom was positioned right across the hall from the bathroom, and his door was open. And so Tyler's laying on his bed, he opens his eyes, and he's looking through his open door at the bathroom. And the bathroom, the door is shut, but he can see there's light coming out from underneath the bottom of the door, so he knows someone's in there. And so Tyler's just laying there watching whoever is in there. He's assuming it's his brother, who has a habit of going to the bathroom in the middle of the night. And so he's just kind of watching, and then at some point he hears the flick of the light as it's turned off, and he sees the light disappear from inside of the bathroom. The door swings open, and sure enough, it's his brother who steps back into the hallway. His brother looks into Tyler's room, but doesn't attempt to interact with Tyler. Instead, Will just turns and walks back down the hallway towards his bedroom. And so as Tyler is listening to the sound of his brother's footsteps fade down the hallway, he closes his eyes again and prepares to go back to sleep. But as he's laying there with his eyes closed, he can tell that his brother has stopped short of his bedroom and has turned around and is now walking back up the hallway towards the bathroom and towards Tyler's room. And so Tyler opens his eyes again because he knows his brother is about to be right in front of his bedroom. And he's thinking, okay, maybe he forgot something in the bathroom. And so Tyler decides to just watch to see what his brother does. And so sure enough, Will walks all the way up until he's standing right in front of Tyler's open door. But instead of going into the bathroom, Will walks into Tyler's room. And right away, Tyler sits up and says, hey, what are you doing? What's going on? And his brother, he pauses for a second and he begins to say something that sounds like he saw something out there, but he's hesitant. He doesn't really know how he wants to frame the thing he wants to say. And so Tyler's like, come on, what are you doing? It's the middle of the night. What's going on? And finally, Will just blurts out, I keep seeing a man wearing stripes at the end of the hallway. And so Tyler, he hears this and he can't compute what he's being told. And so he just says, what? What are you talking about, Will? What did you see in the hallway? And Will would say again, I keep seeing a man wearing stripes at the end of the hallway. I've seen him a couple times in the last couple of days. I go to the bathroom, and then when I start walking back, I see him outside the back door in our backyard. And so Tyler is so scared because his brother does not sound like he's making a joke. His brother sounds like he's telling the truth. And just the fact that his brother can't quite find the words to describe what he saw made it seem even more real. And so Tyler, he gets out of bed and he says, Will, we gotta go tell Mom. But that required going into the hallway and going down the hall towards where apparently this man in stripes was to get to their mother's bedroom. And so Will, who initially was not that scared of this man in stripes he had seen, was now starting to get pretty panicked in seeing Tyler's reaction to this. And so Will tells Tyler, stay right there, stay in the room. And so Will, he kind of peeks back into the hallway and he looks all the way down and there is no man in stripes anymore. There's no one in the hall. And so he tells Tyler, the coast is clear, and the two of them run down the hallway all the way right in front of that door that leads into the back of the property where the man in stripes was, and they turn left and they go into their parents' bedroom where just their mother was because their father was out of town. And so they charge in there, they wake their mom up, and they're talking over each other, trying to communicate to their mom that there was a ghost, that there was an intruder, that there was something bad happening around their house. And so finally their mom just tells them to be quiet, and she says, okay, boys, sit on the bed. I'm gonna go have a look around the house. And so the two boys do as they're told. They sit on the bed and their mom leaves the bedroom. She goes into the hallway and she looks immediately to her left where the man in stripes supposedly was, and she doesn't see anything. She just looks out into their backyard. There's nothing there. She looks down the other direction out the front of the house, doesn't see anything. She walks all around the house. She goes outside. She looks everywhere, but she doesn't see anyone or anything. And so eventually she comes back inside the house. She goes up to the second floor. She goes back to her bedroom and she tells her boys, look, you probably just spooked yourselves. There is no man in stripes. You're totally safe. You're totally fine. Just go back to bed. You probably just imagined whatever you saw. And so Will, who was the one who saw the man in stripes, was very quick to accept his mother's answer. It actually seemed like it was a relief to have somebody tell him that what you had seen wasn't real. And so he very happily went back to his bed and he fell asleep. But Tyler, who had not seen the man in stripes, but had a very intense reaction to hearing his brother describe it, could not accept his mother's answer. It just totally freaked him out because his brother was always joking around about stuff, but this did not feel like a joke. This felt very, very real. But over the course of the next couple of days, weeks, months, years, Will never claimed to see the man in stripes again, and so pretty quickly, Tyler forgot about it. Fast forward 11 years to 2009, so Tyler is now 18 years old, and he and his mom were out in the car running some errands. And as they're driving around, they were just chatting about all sorts of different things, and at some point, they began talking about one of their beloved family pets, a dog named Max that they had when Tyler was really young. And so as they're kind of swapping stories about all the goofy things that this dog did, Tyler's mom suddenly says, hey, Tyler, do you remember the time that I opened the front door to let the cops into the house and Max came bounding into the house and he went right into the kitchen and he ripped open all the food? And Tyler's looking at his mom like, wait, when did the cops come to our house? When did you open the door to let the cops come into our house. And as soon as Tyler said this to his mom looked at him as if she had just given away something she hadn't meant to. And then she kind of relaxed and said, you know what? I never got around to telling you. Now that I'm thinking about it, you and your brother were asleep and you didn't even know this happened. And then afterward, me and your father decided not to tell you guys because we didn't want to scare you. Back when you were about 7 years old and Will was about 10 years old, your dad was away at work and we were all asleep one night when suddenly I wake up to the sound of someone or something moving around outside of our house. And so I sit up in bed and I go into the hallway and I look left and I look out that door into our backyard and I see standing up against the glass this man with his hands pressed to the window looking into the house. And so Tyler's mom would tell him how she totally freaked out and she flipped on the lights and it scared this guy who ran off. And then she called the police and then the police showed up and that's when their dog Max came bounding inside and shredded the bag of food. And the police, they searched the property, but apparently they never found this guy. Tyler's mom would go on to tell him that the police warned her that her description of this man that was standing at their back door matched the description of a man who was wanted for murder who was on the loose in the area. Tyler was dumbfounded. He didn't remember this because obviously he had been asleep because this is something he would have remembered. And so he had so many questions about this whole situation. But the first question he asked his mom was, well, what did he look like? And his mom said, well, he was tall, he had dark hair, he had blue jeans on, and oh, you know what? He had a striped shirt on. It would turn out for a couple of days in the summer of 1998, this suspected murderer who was on the run from police had apparently been hiding out on Tyler's family's property. And in the middle of the night, for whatever reason, this suspected murderer would walk over to the back door of the second floor hallway and he would put his face up to the glass and he would stare into their home. This was the man in stripes that Will claimed to have seen. He was real. Tyler, after making this connection, would follow up with his family members and he would do some digging of his own, but he was never able to figure out who the man in stripes was or what happened to him. In 2012, a 22-year-old woman named Simone was living in a small winemaking village called Rüdesheim am Rhein, which is located in southwestern Germany. This village is strikingly beautiful. It's full of quaint European homes, and there's lots of rolling green hills with vineyards as far as the eye can see, and the village sits right on the banks of the Rhine River. Simone had grown up in this picturesque village, and she had loved it, but this was going to be her last summer before she left and headed off to New York City to start the next chapter of her life. And while she was excited about that, she was also kind of sad because this village and everybody inside of it were the only things she had ever known. And so the idea of leaving them behind just seemed very strange to her. But instead of focusing on the kind of growing anxiety around her imminent departure from Germany, she focused on what she would be doing that summer while she was still in Germany. Some of Simone's fondest memories of her childhood were of her time spent at summer camp. And this summer camp was located in this forest that was not far from her village. And every summer in July, Simone, along with about 200 other kids from her village and from neighboring villages, would converge on the campgrounds in the forest for 2 weeks of playing games and going on scavenger hunts and putting on stage plays and just generally having a really good time. But when Simone became a teenager and was too old to be a camp attendee, she decided she would volunteer and be a camp counselor. And she found it was awesome. She immediately connected with the other camp counselors and she felt all grown up, having a real job, and she loved goofing around with all of the kids. And so every summer since that first time volunteering, Simone had gone back and volunteered again. And this summer was no different. So in mid-July of that year, Simone packed up her things and she headed off to the forest. The way this camp worked was the 200 plus kids that were attending the camp, they would get dropped off in the mornings each day by their parents and they'd play and run around all day. And then in the late afternoon, their parents would come back and pick them up. So none of the kids were sleeping over at the camp during these 2 weeks. However, the 30 plus counselors, they would just stay at the camp for the full 2 weeks. They would just sleep in tents tents out in the forest. Technically, the reason they did this was to make sure they had enough time in the morning to prep the campgrounds for the kids, and then also in the evenings to have enough time to clean up and kind of have it ready for the next day. But in reality, Simone and the other counselors all knew that the camping out in the forest was the best part of the volunteer experience. After all the kids went home for the night, all of the counselors would finish up all of their duties and then rush off into the forest where their tents were and where there was a fire pit, and they would have some beers and wine because the legal drinking age in Germany is actually 16. So all these counselors are having a couple of drinks, and then before long they'd be laughing and telling stories and just generally having a great time. So that July in 2012, Simone and the other counselors arrived at the campgrounds a day early, and they caught up with each other and they prepared the campground. And then the next morning, all the kids showed up and everything went off without a hitch. And then that afternoon, after all the kids had been picked up by their parents, Simone and the other counselors rushed to finish up all their duties and then headed off into the woods to enjoy their first night hanging out together. After a couple of beers had been passed around the campfire, everybody was in good spirits and laughing and telling stories. But pretty quickly, people started to fade and get tired because, it was their first day back at camp and it had been a long, tiring day. And so people very gradually began retiring to their tents to go to bed. And eventually Simone, too, had crawled into her tent and gotten onto her cot to try to sleep herself. But she found that night it was so hot she couldn't be in her tent. It was stifling inside of there. And so she decides she's just going to sleep out in the open where it's a little bit cooler. And so she picks up her fold-up cot and she brings it out into the open, and she sees there are several other counselors who have done the same thing. And so she puts her cot down next to one of her good friends who's already asleep in her cot. And then Simone climbs into her cot, she gets under her covers, and she tries to fall asleep. But for the next hour, Simone just tosses and turns, she can't get comfortable, and by that time, everybody else has completely passed out. So it's just her, she's counting down the time until she has to get up again to start the next day, and so she's getting stressed about that. But eventually, she would fall asleep. However, she would immediately be thrust into one of the most visceral and intense nightmares she had ever had in her entire life. In her dream, she opens her eyes and she looks out in front of her, and it's this desert city, and there are hundreds of people all in front of her, just standing there looking up at her. And then she notices on her left and on her right are these two men, these big, huge men that are both working on something behind her. She doesn't really know what it is, but they're obviously busy doing something. And she kind of glances up at one of them and she notices he's holding something that looks like a wreath, like a holiday wreath you would hang on your door. And so Simone looks away from the guy with the wreath and just looks back out at this huge sea of people, which is totally bizarre because no one's moving, no one's making any sound, they're just staring at her. And then she feels this shooting pain in the top of her head. The man who was standing on her right was not holding a holiday wreath. He was holding a crown of thorns, and now he, along with the guy on the other side of her, were working together to press this crown of thorns into her head. And so Simone is feeling the thorns being pressed deeper and deeper into her scalp, and she tries to fight them off, but she realizes she can't move. She can't even turn her head to look at them. She can only see them out of her periphery vision. And then she tries to scream out for help to someone in the crowd to come help her, but when she opens her mouth, no sound comes out. And so as she's sitting there, all she can do is stare straight out ahead of her as the pressure of these thorns are driven deeper and deeper into her skin. And then at some point, blood begins dripping down in front of her eyes. And around that point, the pain became so blinding, so awful, that it woke her up. And as soon as she woke up, she shot up and she reached for her head to make sure there was no crown of thorns on her. And as she's doing that, she's thinking, okay, phew, it was just a dream. That was just a horrible dream. I'm in this forest. I'm good. I'm safe. And as she's kind of patting on her head, she's realizing her head is wet. And as she's touching her head, she's realizing it hurts. There's a stinging pain in her head. And then she realizes it's not just a stinging pain, it's a throbbing, intense pain all over her head. And so as she's kind of having this realization that her dream is now kind of segued into her real life, she looks out ahead of her and she sees off in the distance in the tree line, something is running through the woods. She can't tell who or what it is, but she makes a mental note that there is someone running away from them. But this pain in her head has gotten so intense that she can't focus on anything else. She can only focus on the pain. And as she's thinking about how much her head hurts, she screams in pain. And the girl who was laying next to her that had been asleep, she wakes up to the sound of the scream, but it's totally pitch black. She has no idea what's going on with Simone. And so this girl, she sits up and she's trying to get Simone to tell her what's going on, but Simone has no idea. She's totally frantic. She can't really make sense of what's happening. And so this friend, she reaches down and she picks up a flashlight, she turns it on, and she aims the light at Simone, illuminating her head. And when this friend sees Simone's head, she starts to scream. Seconds later, the rest of the counselors that had been sleeping out were awake, and they were rushing Simone, who was now shaking and vomiting, over to one of the staff vans. And then 15 minutes later, they had driven her to the emergency room. It would turn out, after Simone had finally fallen asleep and she began having that really intense dream about a crown of thorns being dug into her scalp, well, in reality, something was digging into her scalp and it was kind of manifesting itself in her dream. And what was digging into her scalp was the jaws of a fox. This fox had snuck into the campsite and walked right up behind Simone and just started eating her head. And amazingly, it did not wake Simone up right away. And so this fox got 20 or so serious bites out of Simone's head before she shot up and scared it away. And so almost certainly what Simone saw running away from her in that quick moment was the fox. Doctors were able to save Simone and stitch her head back together, and they were even able to hide all of the scars in her hairline so you can't even see them. But despite her being physically okay today, psychologically, this was a very traumatizing event. Not only does she refuse now to go into any forest, whether it's day or night, but she also periodically still gets phantom pains in her scalp that feels like the fox is biting her head all over again. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please spend a nice long day at the beach and then afterwards make a special trip to the Like Button's house so you can shake your towel off directly into one of their open windows. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast just called MrBallen Podcast where we upload never before heard stories on Monday morning. Again, it's just called MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, anywhere you find podcasts, you can find it. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes, and the other is called MrBallen en Español, and it is a Spanish language channel. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen that puts out near daily content. We also have a Snapchat channel just called MrBallen that puts out content on Sundays. We have some really cool merchandise. If you want to have a look, go to shopmrballen.com. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.